The enemy commander crushed her radio beneath his boot, looked down at her bleeding in the snow, and laughed. "Tell headquarters," he said into his own radio, loud enough for her to hear, "the ghost is dead." He never looked back. Captain Elena Brooks lay in the frozen dirt, a bullet lodged 2 inches from her spine, listening to his footsteps fade into the dark. Her team scattered. Her command had already pulled extraction. Every protocol said this was over. But Elena Brooks had spent 11 years learning one thing the enemy never accounted for. Dead soldiers don't have rules to follow. If this story pulls you in, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The Black Talon Highlands didn't look like a place where people died. That was the problem. From the satellite imagery, it looked like every other stretch of frozen terrain in that region. Ridgelines draped in pine and stone, snowpack thick enough to swallow a man to his waist, the kind of landscape that showed up in nature documentaries with sweeping orchestral scores. Beautiful. Remote. Quiet. Elena had been in enough quiet places to know the silence was never what it appeared to be. She moved at the back of the 6-person column, scanning rear and left, while Corporal Marcus Webb took right. Their breath fogged in the dark. No one spoke. Radio chatter was compressed to single-click signals, 1 click for clear, 2 for hold, 3 for abort. The team had run together long enough that language was mostly unnecessary. They communicated in weight shifts and hand signals, and the particular way someone's head turned when something felt wrong. Advanced reconnaissance, limited engagement, full deniability. That was the official language. In practice, get in, photograph the communication arrays at grid reference November 7, confirm or deny enemy troop movements in the northern corridor, get out before anyone realized you were there. Simple. Except nothing about the Highlands had ever been simple. Elena adjusted the strap on her pack and watched the pine trees. Not the gaps between them, the trees themselves. The way weight settled in branches. The way snow fell or didn't fall when something disturbed the air nearby. Sergeant Dara Osei was on point, 40 meters ahead. Elena trusted Dara's instincts more than most pieces of technology she'd been issued. The woman had grown up hunting in the kind of terrain that punished carelessness, and she moved through difficult ground the way water moved, finding the path of least resistance without appearing to search for it. Dara stopped. One raised fist. The column froze. Elena was already moving forward, crouched, keeping to the shadow of a boulder that jutted from the snowfield at an angle that suggested geological violence in its past. She reached Dara in under 20 seconds. "What do you have?" Dara didn't point. Pointing created movement. Instead, she shifted her chin left toward a section of ridgeline that should have been empty at this hour. Elena looked. Nothing. Tree line, snow, darkness, rock. Then, there. The faintest displacement of shadow against shadow, something that moved in a rhythm too regular to be wind. A patrol. She pressed back against the boulder, doing the math in her head. They were 3 kilometers from their target and already in a sector that their pre-mission intelligence had flagged as low threat. No enemy presence in this zone, the briefing had said. The last confirmed patrol route ran 8 kilometers south. "That's not supposed to be here," Dara murmured. "No," Elena agreed. She pulled back and hand-signaled to the rest of the column. Hold position, maintain silence, await orders. Then she keyed her radio twice, hold, and studied the ridgeline. There were 2 figures, then 3. Then, as her eyes adjusted and she stopped trying to find them and simply let them exist in her peripheral vision, she counted 7. 7 wasn't a patrol. 7 was a blocking force. "Fall back to secondary waypoint," she said quietly. "Dara, take point. Webb, stay with me." The column pivoted without noise and Elena moved last, watching behind them. The enemy patrol, if that was what it was, hadn't increased its movement, hadn't signaled alarm, just maintained that steady, almost leisurely sweep of the ridgeline. They're not searching, she realized. They're waiting. The secondary waypoint was a rock formation a kilometer back, shaped like a broken tooth, marked on their terrain maps with the grid designation Oscar 4. Elena had selected it during mission planning because it offered 3 covered approaches and visual sightlines to both the target and the extraction corridor. She got there and immediately saw the problem. Two of those three approaches were already covered, not by rocks or terrain, by men. Prone in the snow, wearing white over white camouflage she would have walked past if she hadn't been specifically looking for exactly this kind of thing. They weren't moving, they were positioned. The way you position people when you knew where someone was going to be before they got there. Elena stopped the column with a hand signal and crouched behind a fallen pine, its snow-weighted branches forming a kind of natural screen. She pulled Webb down beside her. "We have a problem," she said. "I count 2, Webb said, already scanning. "I count 4. Look at the northeast face." A pause. Then, "Jesus." "They knew our secondary," she said. Not a question. Webb looked at her in the dark, and she could see him working through it. The same arithmetic she'd already done. Their routes, waypoints, and grid references were classified above the operational level. Nobody outside their chain of command had access to their movement plan. Nobody outside a very small circle even knew this mission was happening. She keyed her radio. "Full team frequency, compressed burst. Oscar 4 is compromised. Do not approach. Rally at contingency position Kilo." 3 clicks. 4. 5. 6. 5 responses. She had 6 team members besides herself. She counted again. 5 responses. Specialist Jerome Tatum was not answering. Jerome had been with the unit 8 months, 24 years old out of Fort Bragg, cross-trained in signals and close-quarters breach. Quiet in the way that some soldiers were quiet. Not reserved, just economical, saying what needed saying and nothing more. Elena had run 3 operations with him. He was reliable, careful. His last confirmed position was 200 meters back along the approach trail. Elena looked at the 2 enemy soldiers in the snow, then at Webb, then at the tree line where Tatum should have been. "I need to go back," she said. "Captain, radio silence unless the team takes contact. Get everyone to contingency Kilo and hold." She pressed her radio into his hand. She'd switched to her backup. "Don't wait more than 20 minutes. Webb grabbed her arm. Not insubordination, just the reflex of a man who'd seen enough to know what 20 minutes in hostile terrain could look like. "You know what this looks like," he said. "I know what it looks like. And you're still going back. He's one of ours." Webb released her arm and said nothing else. He didn't agree with the decision. He also understood there was nothing to say. Elena moved back into the dark. She found Jerome's radio first. It lay in the snow 8 meters off the trail, and she almost missed it. It had been placed carefully, not dropped, pressed into the shadow of a root so that it wouldn't catch light. That deliberateness was the first thing that struck her as wrong. Equipment didn't land that way in a fall, or even a quick struggle. It was set down by someone who knew where to put it. Her hand found her sidearm without a conscious decision. She moved in a slow arc around the radio, keeping low, reading the snow for prints. She found them. 3 sets coming in from the northeast, a 4th going out in the same direction. The 4th set matched the tread of military spec boots. American pattern. She knew Jerome wore size 11. The prints went northeast. She followed them for 80 meters, moving carefully through terrain that grew more broken as the ridgeline rose. Chunks of granite pushing through the snow at odd angles, pine trunks stripped bare, below chest height from winter wind. The prints led her to a depression between 2 boulders, and she dropped below the lip of it before looking in. Jerome was there. He was alive, sitting with his back against one of the boulders, knees bent, not bound. Across from him, in the shadow of the opposite rock, a man crouched and spoke to him in a voice too low to carry. Jerome nodded twice. The man handed him something. She couldn't see what, and Jerome pocketed it. Elena didn't move. Every tactical training session she'd ever sat through had something to say about the moment when an established assumption collapsed. The enemy is outside your perimeter, so the inside is safe. Your team member is your ally, so their position is your position. These were the kinds of assumptions that felt so foundational that questioning them never occurred to most people. She watched Jerome accept whatever the man had handed him. She watched Jerome nod a 3rd time. She watched the man melt back into the shadow and disappear. Then Jerome straightened up, checked his watch, and began moving, not back toward the team's last known position, but northeast, in the same direction the prince had come from. Elena stayed in the depression for 6 seconds. 6 seconds was longer than she normally allowed herself to do nothing, but she needed those seconds to get her thinking straight, To push past the feeling in her chest that wasn't quite betrayal and wasn't quite disbelief, but was something in the uncomfortable territory between them. Then she followed him. She tracked Jerome for 400 meters through increasingly difficult terrain, staying far enough back that he wouldn't hear her, but close enough to keep him in occasional sight. He moved with purpose, which told her he knew where he was going. He didn't check his map or compass. He didn't hesitate at forks in the terrain. He'd been here before. Mentally or physically, he knew this ground. The place he led her to was a shallow bowl in the mountainside, naturally sheltered from 3 directions by ridgeline, the 4th open to a view down the valley that on a clear day would have been spectacular. In the dark, it just meant good visibility toward any approaching threat. There were 5 men waiting, and among them, standing at the center of the small group, with the easy posture of someone who had never needed to worry about being found in a place they shouldn't be, was a man Elena had never seen in person, but had spent considerable time studying in briefings. She knew the cheekbones, the particular set of the jaw, the way the beard was maintained, neat along the edges, longer at the chin, as if someone who normally didn't care about appearances had made one deliberate concession to vanity. Rashid Karim. The name moved through her like cold water. Rashid Karim was supposed to be 600 kilometers south. The last confirmed intelligence on his position placed him at a mountain safe house near the provincial border, where he'd been for the past 3 weeks. His movement north would have triggered surveillance flags across 3 separate monitoring systems. Either those systems had failed simultaneously, or they'd been deliberately misdirected. Jerome reached the group and spoke. She was too far to hear words, but the body language was legible. Report being given, questions answered, confirmation provided. Jerome's hands moved through the gestures of someone describing terrain. He was giving them the team's positions, the positions he'd just been at. Elena pressed herself flat against the ground and put her back to a rock, no longer watching. Her mind ran through what she knew and what it meant with the dispassionate efficiency of someone doing math, not because she felt dispassionate, but because falling apart here would get people killed. Jerome had known the mission. He knew the waypoints. He'd been their signals specialist, which meant he'd been in direct contact with everything transmitted to and from their command net. How long? That was the question that sat at the center of everything like a stone in still water, sending ripples in every direction. How long had he been feeding information? 1 operation? 10? Months? She stopped herself. Not now. Figure it out later. Right now she needed to get back to her team, call in what she'd found, and extract before Karim's men moved to close off the escape routes Jerome had just described. She started moving. She made it 200 meters before the night exploded. Not metaphorically. The ridge above her lit up with the flat, cracking sound of automatic weapons fire, and then a grenade detonated somewhere to her northeast with a concussion that she felt in her teeth. Radio traffic burst across her earpiece. Webb's voice, controlled but tight. Contact northeast, multiple shooters. We are receiving fire at Oscar 4. She broke into a run. Snow grabbed at her boots and threw off her balance twice in the first 100 meters. She ignored it. The firing was coming from the ridge above the contingency position, which meant they'd gotten there ahead of the team. Jerome had given them enough lead time. She came around a rock formation and nearly collided with Corporal Hannah Reyes, who had blood on her left sleeve and was moving at a controlled jog, not a run, which meant she was hurt but functional. Captain, Reyes said it without surprise, as if Elena materializing out of the darkness was entirely expected. How bad? Graze. Doesn't matter right now. Webb's holding at the secondary cache with Ose and Petrov. We lost Tatum. Tatum's alive, Elena said. He's the problem. Reyes stared at her for 1 beat, parsing what that meant, and Elena watched her face move through the same sequence of responses. Confusion, refusal, comprehension, cold acceptance, in about 2 seconds, faster than most people could do it. It was one of the things that made Reyes good at her job. How long? Reyes asked. Don't know. We deal with it later. Okay. Just like that. Webb's being pushed south. If they pin us against the ridgeline, they won't. Elena was already moving, and Reyes fell in behind her. They want the intelligence package. They won't destroy the drives by collapsing the ridge on top of us. How do you know they know about the drives? Elena didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about Jerome in the bowl with Karim, hands describing terrain, and what else those hands might have described over however many months the betrayal had been running. Because they knew everything else, she said. Webb had set up a defensive position behind a cluster of boulders that commanded the approach from two directions, with Osei on the northern angle and Petrov, the youngest of them, 22, who had never been in a firefight until 8 months ago and was now methodical in the way people became methodical when something had burned away the fear and left pure focus, covering the western approach. Elena slid in beside Webb as a burst of fire clipped the rock above her head, sending chips of stone rattling down across her shoulders. "Sit rep," she said. 6 confirmed shooters on the ridge, unknown number moving to flank from the south, Webb said, not looking at her, his eyes on the tree line. "They've got elevation on us, which is the bad news. The good news is they're not using anything heavier than small arms, which tells me they want us alive or they want the equipment intact. Or both." "Or both," he agreed. "Extraction got aborted, by the way. Command lost our signal around 10 minutes ago and declared comms compromised. We're on our own." Elena absorbed this. "Do we still have the package?" "Petrov's got it." She looked at Petrov. He held her gaze and nodded once, his free hand moving briefly to the hard case secured to his chest rig. "Good. Tatum," she said. "He's been feeding them. Positions, routes, probably the comms encryption keys, which would explain why they burned our signal." Webb turned to look at her directly for the first time. She could see him wanting to push back, wanting more evidence, and she watched him decide against it. "What do we do with that?" he said. "Nothing right now. Use it to predict their next move. Jerome knew our contingency positions, every one of them, which means we can't go to any of them. We don't exactly have a lot of other options. We make one." She pulled out her terrain map, physical, not digital, because she'd learned years ago to keep one, and spread it across the rock between them. The map was laminated, but one corner had gotten wet during the approach, and the paper inside was starting to separate from the plastic, and she had to hold it flat with her palm while the wind tried to take it. "Here," she said, pointing, "the eastern drainage. It's not on the route plan because it's brutal. Drops 200 meters and half a kilometer over pure ice. But Jerome didn't know about it. It wasn't part of the official terrain assessment." "How do you know about it?" "I read the geological survey for the region. Did it on my own time." Webb looked at the map, then at the eastern slope, then back at her. "You read geological surveys in your spare time?" "Sometimes," she said. "Okay." He didn't question it further. "How do we get there from here without those shooters pinning us against the boulder field?" The answer was a 3-minute firefight, a smoke grenade she'd been conserving since mission start, and a decision on Elena's part to do something that her tactical training flagged as categorically inadvisable. "I'm going to draw their attention north," she said. "When the smoke goes, everyone moves east. Don't wait for me." "Captain, I have the override frequency on my backup radio. If I'm not at the drainage head in 6 minutes, you keep moving." She met Webb's eyes. "Do not wait." He didn't like it. She could see that clearly. But Webb had been in the military long enough to know the difference between an order he disagreed with and an order he could override, and this wasn't the second kind. 6 minutes, he said. She moved before he could say anything else. The north angle of the boulder field gave her a clear view up the ridge, and she could see at least 3 of the shooters from her position, muzzle flash locating them with each burst. She put a controlled burst toward the leftmost position, not trying to hit anyone particularly, just establishing a location for them to fix on. The return fire was immediate and heavy. She moved laterally along the boulder line, keeping low, keeping noise consistent. The key was to seem like a full element, not a single person. Change positions, vary rate of fire, make them calculate a larger defensive force than was actually present. It bought maybe 90 seconds of confusion. 90 seconds was what she needed. The smoke grenade went at the 60-second mark. She pulled the pin and let it cook for 3 seconds before dropping it at the base of the boulder field, where the wind would carry the cloud northeast. It bloomed orange-gray in the darkness, and the fire from the ridge shifted, recalculating. She ran, east, across open snowfield, moving in the broken S pattern she'd trained into herself until it was muscle memory, the pattern designed to make leading a moving target maximally difficult. Twice she heard rounds strike snow close enough that she felt the impact through the ground. Once something clipped the pack on her back with enough force to spin her a quarter turn. She didn't fall, The eastern lip of the drainage was marked by a stone outcropping that she had memorized from the map, and she hit it at full speed and went over the edge almost before she saw it. The descent was catastrophic, was the honest word. 45 degrees, pure ice, no real handholds, 800 meters of nothing visible below. She dug her elbows in and used her boots as brakes, shredding the waterproofing off her knees in the first 30 seconds. The cold hit her lungs like swallowing glass. She made it to the drainage head with approximately 90 seconds to spare. Webb was already there. The rest of them were there. They were breathing hard, and Osei had a cut above one eye from a rockfall, but they were all there. The package? Elena managed, still catching her breath. Intact, Petrov said. She nodded. Did a quick count. 4 people. Webb, Reyes, Osei, Petrov. Osei? Not 5. She knew who was missing before she counted, but she counted anyway. Because accuracy mattered, even when the answer was something you didn't want to confirm. Move, she said. They made 12 kilometers in the next 3 hours, moving through terrain that would have been difficult in daylight and was punishing in the dark. No one complained. Complaint required surplus energy, and they had none to spare. They moved in the efficient silence of people who had stopped thinking about comfort and were running on the cleaner fuel of necessity. Elena's backup radio made contact with the forward operating base at 0347 hours. The transmission was fragmentary. The drainage valley was playing hell with the signal, but she got enough through to establish their position and request emergency extraction. Command's response came back in pieces. Copy your position. Extraction non-viable current threat level. Confirm status of intelligence package. Package is intact, she said into the radio. I need extraction. We have wounded. A long pause. Static. Wind. Understand package is partial. Confirm only 60% of target intelligence was recovered prior to contact. Cannot confirm extraction until... She listened to the rest of it and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not defeat. Something quieter and more complicated than defeat. 60%. She had 60% of the intelligence package, and the other 40, the remaining files, the ones she hadn't been able to pull before the ambush, were still inside Kareem's compound. She knew what was in those files. She'd been briefed on the totality of what they were looking for. The 40% that remained wasn't supplementary data or redundant records. It was the operational timeline. Dates, locations, targets, the specific coordinates of planned attacks. She relayed this to Webb as the team settled into a temporary hide beneath an overhang, out of the wind. He listened without interrupting. How many people? He asked when she finished. The briefing estimated several hundred at minimum, possibly more, depending on which attack sites were active. Webb was quiet for a moment. Reyes had her head back against the rock and her eyes closed, not sleeping, just conserving. Osei was rewrapping the cut on his forehead with the methodical patience of someone who'd done it before. Petrov sat slightly apart, watching the approach. We're not going back in, Webb said. It wasn't a question. I didn't say that. Captain, I said I didn't say that. She met his eyes. And the decision isn't made yet, so let's not have this argument until I tell you we're having it. Webb didn't push. He'd known her long enough. She didn't sleep. She rarely slept well in the field, and tonight her mind was running too hot. She sat with her back against the overhang stone and thought about Jerome Tatum, 24 years old, out of Bragg, hands describing terrain in the dark. And she thought about the 40% of the intelligence package still inside a fortified enemy compound, and she thought about the particular way that Rashid Kareem had stood at the center of his men with the ease of someone who expected to win. Tell headquarters the ghost is dead. She turned the words over in her mind. Kareem had gotten a lot of things right about this operation. He'd predicted their routes. He'd known their waypoints. He'd planted a source inside the team itself. He'd executed the ambush with the kind of precision that required extensive preparation and high-quality intelligence. But he'd made one mistake. He'd let her walk away from it. Not intentionally. He thought she was dead or close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. But in operational terms, that decision, to declare her dead and redirect his forces toward consolidation rather than confirmation, had left one variable unaccounted for. The variable was currently sitting against a rock overhang in an enemy-held mountain range with nothing to lose. Around 500, Ethan Cole woke from a light sleep and moved to sit beside her. Cole was the team's second in command, officially ranked below Webb, practically positioned as Elena's thinking partner when she needed one. He had the rare quality of being useful in silences. He didn't try to fill them. He sat with her for a few minutes before speaking. "You're going to tell us we have to go back," he said. "I'm going to give us the option to consider it." "What does that mean in practice?" "It means I'm not ordering anyone back in. I can't order anyone back in. Command has pulled us, which means anything we do from this point is unofficial." Cole nodded slowly. "And you're going anyway." "I'm considering it." "You've already decided." She didn't deny it. There wasn't much point in denying things to people who knew you well enough to read the decision and how you were sitting. "The files we didn't get," she said. "The operational timeline. 2 days, maybe less, before those attack windows open. If the information gets used, I know what the information is." "Then you know why." Cole was quiet. The wind had dropped in the last hour, and the mountains were very still. In the pale beginnings of pre-dawn, the ridgeline above them had gone from black to deep gray, and she could start to make out the shapes of individual rocks. "I'm going with you," Cole said. "I didn't ask." "I know you didn't ask." He paused. "How do you want to do it?" Elena looked at the eastern ridgeline, then down the valley, then at her terrain map, now almost fully delaminated, the paper soft and wrinkled from the cold. Kareem's compound was 12 kilometers east and 300 meters below. She had been inside twice before, not physically, but through imagery and architectural analysis. She knew the entry points. She knew the guard rotation schedule, or at least what it had been 3 weeks ago. She knew the location of the server room where the remaining files would be stored. She also knew that her wound from the firefight, she hadn't told the team yet, but she'd taken a ricochet fragment through the side during the eastern descent, was going to make the next 12 kilometers considerably more difficult than the last 12. She pressed her hand against it beneath her jacket, still leaking. Not catastrophically, but insistently. Dead soldiers don't have rules to follow. She refolded the map and looked at Cole. "We move at first light," she said. "I need you to wake Petrov, quietly. He's the one who's going to get the files out if I can't carry them." "What about Webb and the others?" "They take what we recovered to the extraction point, the complete 60%. Command needs that regardless of what happens to us." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You know what this looks like," he said. She almost smiled at that. Webb had said the same thing about going back for Jerome. "I know what it looks like," she said. She briefed Webb at 0520. He didn't take it well. She hadn't expected him to. "You're wounded," he said. His voice was low because he was professional enough not to wake the others before necessary. "You're operating on no sleep in enemy-held territory with compromised command communication, and you want to take 2 people back into a fortified position that already had foreknowledge of your presence. The compound won't have foreknowledge this time. They think we're gone." "That is not reassuring." "The files, Marcus." She used his first name. She didn't do it often. "You know what's in them." Webb stared at the ground between them. She could see him running the math, the same math she'd been running since 0347. The calculation of acceptable risk against probable consequence. The cold arithmetic of military ethics, which was rarely clean and never comfortable. "Give me one of the radios," she said. "If we're not at the secondary extraction point in 18 hours, you call in what you have, and you tell them everything I told you about Tatum. Don't sit on it. Don't wait for us." Webb didn't respond immediately. "You come back," he said finally. "That's the plan." "That's not what I said. I said you come back." He met her eyes. "Both of you." "We'll do our best." "Your best better be good enough this time, Captain, because I am not writing the after-action report that explains this to anyone." He pressed the radio into her hand. 18 hours. She took the radio. 18 hours. She turned east toward the compound, toward Kareem's 12 kilometers of mountain and whatever waited on the other side of them, and she started walking. The dawn was just beginning to touch the peaks above. Pale gold on gray stone, the kind of cold morning light that made everything look carved from the same material as the sky. Behind her, she heard Cole fall into step. She didn't look back. They were 3 kilometers out when her radio crackled once with a burst transmission from command. Short, compressed, barely audible through the static. She pressed the earpiece in and listened to it twice to make sure she'd heard correctly. She had. All units. Intelligence confirms previously listed KYA, Captain Elena Brooks, remains unconfirmed. Adjust records pending verification. She nearly laughed. They weren't even sure she was dead, and already the machine was adjusting its paperwork. Cole glanced at her when she didn't respond to the transmission. "They're updating the casualty list," she said. "What does it say?" "That I'm probably dead." He absorbed this. And she looked at the ridgeline, at the thin strip of dawn light creeping across stone and ice, at the 12 kilometers of enemy terrain between her and a compound full of information that was going to get people killed if she didn't go get it. "And now," she said, "no one's going to be looking for me." She kept walking. Cole kept pace. The mountains kept their silence the way they always had, indifferent, enormous, holding whatever happened in them with equal gravity, whether it was beautiful or terrible, whether anyone survived it or no one did. 3 kilometers back, Webb watched them disappear into the gray light. He stood there for a moment after they vanished. Then he turned to Reyes and Osei and Petrov, and he said very quietly, "Pack up. We move in 5. And somewhere in the darkness of a compound 12 kilometers east, a man who had already declared victory sat over maps and plans and smiled at his own efficiency, completely unaware that the ghost he'd buried was walking back toward him through the dawn. The 12 kilometers took 4 hours and 20 minutes, not because of the terrain, though the terrain was bad enough. Loose shale beneath ice crust, gradient that punished every downhill step, 2 creek crossings where the ice held but only just, the sound of it cracking underfoot in a way that made the stomach drop regardless of how many times you'd crossed ice before. The time came from the wound. Elena's side had stopped the dramatic bleeding somewhere around kilometer 4, which she'd initially taken as a good sign until she recognized it as the body's way of adjusting to a new equilibrium rather than the wound actually closing. The fragment was still in there. She could feel it differently now. Not the sharp, insistent pain of the first hours, but a deep structural discomfort, the kind that suggested something that wasn't supposed to move was moving slightly with each stride. She'd packed it with what she had in her kit and wrapped it tight and stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it didn't help anything, and they had 11 kilometers left to walk. Cole noticed around kilometer 6. He didn't say anything then. He slowed his pace to match hers without commenting on why he was slowing it, which was its own kind of comment. At kilometer 8, during a 5-minute rest behind a boulder field, he said, "Let me look at it. It's fine. You've been listing left for 2 kilometers. The terrain's uneven. The terrain's been uneven for 8 kilometers. You weren't listing before." He wasn't being aggressive about it. He was being factual, which was harder to argue with. "Let me look." She let him look. He pulled back her jacket and the thermal layer beneath and examined what she'd packed into the wound with the expression of someone doing a visual inspection of something mechanical, assessing function, not reacting to appearance. "You should have told Webb," he said. "Webb would have pulled the operation. Webb might have been right to pull the operation." "The files don't pull themselves, Ethan." He resecured the packing, pulled her layers back down, and didn't respond to that. There wasn't really a response to it that would accomplish anything. He handed her 2 ibuprofen from his kit, which they both understood was gesture more than medicine at this point, and she took them anyway because the gesture meant something even when the medicine didn't. 4 more kilometers, she said. 4 more kilometers, he agreed. They moved. The compound emerged from the mountain the way defensive structures always did in this kind of terrain, not as a thing separate from the landscape, but as a continuation of it, built into the rock so that from a distance it looked like a natural formation, just another cluster of stone shapes on a hillside. Up close, the geometry became wrong in ways that were hard to articulate but instantly felt. Angles too regular, shadows too consistent, surfaces that didn't reflect light the way raw stone should. Elena had memorized the aerial imagery of this place. She had the layout in her head the way musicians had scores, not consciously accessed but available, there when needed, organized into the kind of spatial memory that had always come easily to her, and that she'd learned to trust the way other people trusted instruments. She and Cole settled into a shallow depression 200 meters upslope from the compound's northern wall, beneath a stand of wind-stripped pine that offered cover from below without obstructing their sightlines. 4 hours until the guard rotation changes, she said, checking her watch. at the current schedule. You think they maintained the schedule after last night? I think Kareem believes this is over. He confirmed the mission complete. He recovered Jerome. He thinks whatever threat existed went down the drainage with the rest of us. She studied the northern wall. Complacency isn't a guarantee, but it's a probability. And the gap in the rotation? She pointed. Northeast corner. The patrol makes a sweep, returns to post, and there's a 90-second window when the corner isn't directly observed from either the main post or the overlapping patrol route. 90 seconds is enough. Cole looked at where she was pointing, then back at her. You pulled that from 3-week-old intelligence, he said. Best I've got. What if they change the rotation? Then we adapt. She said it without particular drama. We always have options until we don't. Right now we have options. He was quiet for a moment, watching the compound. A guard moved along the top of the southern wall, visible briefly before dropping back behind the parapet. Regular, unhurried. The posture of someone doing a job they expected to be uneventful. What do you need from me at the northeast corner? Cole asked. Cover the approach. If the rotation has changed and someone comes around that corner early, I need exactly 4 seconds of distraction. Just 4? 4 gets me over the wall. After that, I'm inside and it's a different problem. Cole absorbed this without comment. He understood, as she did, that the problems on the other side of the wall were potentially much larger than the problems on this side, and that naming them didn't make them smaller. I'll be on your radio channel, he said. 2 clicks if I see movement. 1 click if it's imminent. 1 click. She checked her equipment. Sidearm, loaded, suppressor attached. The suppressor not a guarantee of silence, but enough reduction in noise signature to matter in a stone compound. Knife. The hard drive copying tool Petrov had left with her, a small device, no bigger than a thumb, that could pull data from a network drive in under 90 seconds with the right access codes. And she had the right access codes because Command had given them to the team before the mission in case physical access to the server was required. Extra magazines. Her backup radio. The wound. She pressed her arm against her side briefly, assessing, stable, uncomfortable, functional. After I'm in, she said, if you don't hear from me in 40 minutes, you go. Same protocol I gave Webb. I'm aware of the protocol. I'm reminding you. I know you're reminding me. A pause. I'll be here at 40 minutes. She almost said something else, decided against it. At 10:23 hours, she moved. The northeast corner was exactly where she'd calculated it, and the 90-second window was real. She counted it from behind a chunk of granite 6 meters from the wall, watching the patrol's shadow disappear around the western curve, listening to the boot falls fade. She was over the wall in 11 seconds. The interior of the compound was arranged around a central courtyard. She'd known this from imagery, but imagery and presence were different things, and she spent 2 seconds against the interior wall simply registering the space, the courtyard, the buildings around it, the way sound moved between them, the number of visible personnel, the position of lights. 3 men in the courtyard, 2 moving, 1 stationary near a doorway on the south side. The moving 2 were in conversation, their posture relaxed, and they were walking away from her position. The stationary one was looking at his phone, the screen casting a pale glow upward across his face. She moved along the interior wall, keeping to the shadow that the eastern building threw across the ground at this hour. Her boots were soft-soled, and she placed each step heel first, rolling forward, an old training habit that had never left her regardless of how much time passed between operations. The server room was in the northern building, basement level, according to the architectural assessment she'd been briefed on. She reached the northern building's exterior door without incident, which she logged as lucky but didn't celebrate, because luck had a way of distributing itself unevenly, and she didn't want to assume she'd been allocated more than her share. The door was unlocked. This surprised her, until she thought about it and stopped being surprised. Compounds in remote terrain didn't lock interior doors the same way perimeter doors were locked. The perimeter was the security. Inside the perimeter, the logic was different. She went in. Basement. Stone steps, poorly lit, a single bulb at the bottom landing throwing harsh shadows against the walls. She moved down them carefully, one hand trailing the wall, not for balance but for the information the wall provided. The particular sound changes that happened when a space was occupied versus empty. Things she had learned to read with her palm as much as her ears. Empty. Or close enough to empty that any occupant wasn't moving. The server room was at the far end of a short corridor, behind a door that was not locked, but had an electronic access panel beside it that was active, the indicator light showing green, which meant it was armed but recently accessed. Recently, in facility management terms, usually meant within the last hour. Someone was using the room, or had just been in it. She stood at the door for 3 seconds, listening. Nothing from inside. No movement, no typing, no breathing that she could distinguish from the baseline ambient noise of the building. She went in. The room was small and cold in the particular way that server rooms were cold. Mechanically, deliberately, the temperature held low enough to protect the equipment. There were 4 server units along the left wall and a single workstation in the center of the room, its monitor dark but with indicator light showing it was still running. On the right wall, a shallow shelf held hard copy files and labeled binders, which she noted but didn't go to yet. She moved to the workstation first because the digital files were the priority, and she plugged Petrov's extraction tool into the access port on the primary server. The device ran its own authentication cycle using the codes command had provided. She watched the indicator light. Amber, 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 then green. Connected. 40 seconds for the transfer to initialize. Then the countdown would begin. She turned to the physical files while the transfer ran. The binders were labeled in a mix of Arabic and what looked like Dari. She had functional literacy in both, enough to read labels, if not to read quickly. She moved through them with her fingertips, reading spines, looking for anything that matched the categories she'd been briefed on. Regional operational plans, personnel files, communication logs. There. A binder labeled with a designation she recognized from the pre-mission briefing, a code name used by Kareem's network for the coordinated attack operation. She pulled it from the shelf, opened it. Physical pages. Printed, not handwritten. Dates, grid coordinates, notation that she recognized as target descriptions. Names of locations she didn't know but could cross-reference against a regional map. This was it. The operational timeline, the piece command needed. She was reaching for her phone to photograph the relevant pages when she heard boots on the stone stairs. One person. Moving with purpose, not urgency. Not someone who'd been alerted, just someone who had a destination. She had approximately 12 seconds before whoever it was reached the bottom of the stairs and could see the server room door. The extraction tool was still running, 30 seconds remaining on the transfer. She checked the indicator, 17% complete. She couldn't pull it. Interrupting the transfer mid-process would corrupt the data and leave evidence of access in the server logs that would be visible to anyone who checked. She took the binder, moved to the right side of the doorway, and pressed flat against the wall. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A pause. Someone checking the corridor. Then they started moving toward the server room. She controlled her breathing. In for 3, out for 4, the way she'd trained herself to do when everything in the body wanted to speed up. And speeding up was the worst possible response. The door opened. The man who entered was young, mid-20s, carrying a tablet, wearing civilian clothes under a military-style vest. He went directly to the workstation without looking anywhere but the monitor, and he was close enough that she could hear the particular frequency of his breathing and smell gun oil and something else, maybe tea, on his jacket. He tapped the monitor awake, looked at the screen. His head turned slightly when he noticed the active transfer indicator, not with alarm, just with the mild curiosity of someone who expected to use a system and found it already in use. Then he looked at the server access port. He saw Petrov's device. His head turned further, toward the right wall. Where she was standing, their eyes met across approximately 2 feet of server room. He inhaled to shout. She moved first. The physical reality of the next 8 seconds was not cinematic and not clean, and she did not think about it in those terms while it was happening. She got a hand over his mouth before the sound fully formed, and she got his arm up his back, and she walked him into the wall hard enough that the impact drove the remaining breath out of him and bought her enough time to get her forearm across his throat in a way that wasn't comfortable for either of them. "Don't," she said quietly in his ear. Not a threat. More like advice. He went still. Not compliant, rigid, which was different, The rigidity of someone calculating options rather than accepting the situation. The device finishes its transfer in, she checked the indicator, 20 seconds. Then I leave. You don't get hurt. He said nothing. She could feel his heartbeat through her forearm, fast and high. His eyes had gone to the door, which she understood, and she shifted her weight to make it clear that the door calculation wasn't going to work out in his favor. 17 seconds. "Where's the captain?" he asked. His English was accented but precise. She didn't answer. "The American woman, the one who survived. Kareem wants to know." 12 seconds. "He assumed dead," the man continued, voice compressed by the forearm but still functional. "But the body was not confirmed. Kareem is—" He stopped, seemed to recalculate what he was saying and who he was saying it to. "He will find you." "Tell him to look harder," she said. 8 seconds. "You took the files." His eyes moved to her hands, where she was still holding the open binder. "That binder. You already have it. You didn't come for the server." 5 seconds. "I came for both," she said. The transfer indicator hit green. She pulled the device, pocketed it, and kept her forearm exactly where it was for another 4 seconds, while she made sure nothing in his posture indicated an imminent decision she'd regret. "I'm going to step back," she said. "You're going to count to 30 before you do anything." A pause. His voice still compressed. "You have a wound, your left side. I can see it in how you're standing." She said nothing. "Kareem will know you were here within minutes of me leaving this room." "Then count slowly," she said. She stepped back, covering the door, and went out. Stunned. She moved back through the corridor and up the stairs fast, but without running. Running created noise, and noise created attention, and she still needed to get back over the wall. The courtyard configuration had changed while she was inside. The stationary guard near the south door had moved, and one of the two who'd been in conversation was now alone and stationary near the northern building's exterior entrance, which was precisely where she needed to go. She stopped inside the door and ran the calculation. The guard was 3 meters from the exterior door. He was facing partially away from her. Not a good angle, but not a direct sightline either. The courtyard between her and the wall she needed to reach was open. No cover except the shadow of the eastern building, which was better on the western approach but still provided some coverage if she stayed tight against the wall. 2 clicks from her radio. "Cole, checking status." She pressed once. Still operational. The guard shifted his weight, looked toward the south end of the courtyard, and she moved. She made it to the eastern building's shadow and pressed against it, 6 meters from the wall, watching the guard. His back was mostly to her now. She had a window. She moved again, faster this time, and she was at the wall and going over it before the guard completed his turn back toward the north. On the other side of the wall, she hit the ground harder than she intended. Her left side took the impact wrong, and the pain spiked from background static to something that briefly made her vision narrow at the edges. She pressed her hand against the wound, breathing through it. 3 seconds, 4, until her vision cleared. Then she moved uphill, toward the pine stand, toward Cole. He was there. He had her before she'd fully cleared the rocks, one hand on her arm, steadying. "You're hurt worse than before," he said. "I have the files." "I can see you have the files. You're also—" "I have the files, and we have about 4 minutes before they know I was in there." She showed him the binder and the extraction device. "We need to move." He looked at her for one long beat, the kind of look that contained an entire argument neither of them had time to have. "Move where?" he said. "North. 3 kilometers. There's an elevated position in the satellite imagery that would give us the signal range to transmit directly to the FOB. If I can get the digital files through and photograph the physical pages, Command gets the complete package. And after that, we figure out getting home." Cole said nothing for a moment. The wind had come back, moving through the stripped pine branches above them with the sound of something breathing. "Kareem will know you were in that room within minutes," he said. "I know. And he'll know you survived. He'll revise his assessment." "I know that too. Which means the entire search picture changes. He'll put everything he has into the surrounding terrain." "Yes." Cole looked at her in the gray mountain light. She looked back at him. The wound in her side was a steady, insistent presence now, something she could no longer pretend was a background fact. 3 kilometers, he said. 3 kilometers, she confirmed. He adjusted her arm over his shoulder without being asked to, redistributing her weight off the left side. She didn't resist it. They started north. Behind them, after a count of 30, a young man in a server room straightened up from the wall, looked at the empty transfer indicator on the primary server, looked at the gap on the shelf where a binder had been, and reached for his radio. His voice, when he transmitted, was calm, in the way that calm people were calm when they had to deliver information they knew would not be well received. "Commander," he said. "She was here." A long pause on the other end, static, wind. Then Kareem's voice, very quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted. "How long ago?" The young man looked at the server room door, the empty corridor beyond it. 4 minutes, he said. Another pause. "Find her. Up on the mountain, 3 kilometers north through pine and stone. 2 people who weren't supposed to be alive were moving through the cold with a binder full of attack plans and a thumb-sized device full of data. And somewhere behind them a man who had already declared victory was learning, for the first time, that he'd made a mistake. He was learning it the way people always learned the most important things, after the moment when it still would have mattered. After the assumption had been acted on and the orders given and the resources committed, when the only option left was response rather than prevention. Rashid Kareem was a careful man. He had built his network carefully, recruited carefully, planned carefully. He did not make many mistakes, but the ones he made completely. He had looked at a wounded woman in the snow and seen something finished. He had walked away. And now, 4 minutes behind 2 people who refused to stop moving, he was learning the particular cost of that particular error. Not yet, not fully, but the first invoice had arrived, and it was written in the language of missing binders and empty server ports, and a server room door standing slightly open at the end of an empty corridor. He looked at the map on the table in front of him, the mountain terrain, the escape routes, the positions of his patrols. "All units," he said into his radio. "Northern quadrant, full sweep. She is injured and she is moving north." He paused. "Do not underestimate her again." He said it flatly, without inflection, as if it were a simple operational instruction. But the man who delivered intelligence to him was close enough to hear the particular quality underneath the flatness. And what he heard there was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something in the uncomfortable space between them. It was the sound of a man recalculating the size of what he was dealing with. On the northern slope, Elena heard the distant sound of radio traffic carrying through the cold air. Fragments of transmission she couldn't make out clearly enough to parse. She didn't need to parse it. She knew what it meant. "They're moving," she said. How far back?" She listened. Estimated distance from signal clarity, wind direction, terrain. 20 minutes, she said. Maybe less. Cole kept his pace steady, her weight partially on his shoulder, the binder under her arm, and the extraction device in her jacket pocket. "Can we make 3 kilometers in 20 minutes?" he asked. She looked at the terrain ahead, the gradient, the ice. "We have to," she said, and they moved. They made the 3 kilometers in 19 minutes. Not because Elena ran, running was no longer something her body would negotiate, but because Cole moved with the kind of efficient desperation that converted fear into pace, and she matched him step for step on pure will, the wound a steady white presence in her side that she had stopped categorizing as pain and started categorizing as information. Information she could work with, information she could manage. The elevated position she'd pulled from satellite imagery was a shelf of granite jutting from the northern slope like the prow of something enormous and ancient, the rock face dropping sharply on 3 sides with the 4th backed against the ridgeline. From the shelf, the valley below opened up completely, a clean 360-degree radio horizon that would have been useless to the enemy because it was also completely exposed, which meant nobody had thought to post a position there, nobody who wasn't trying to transmit from it. She pulled herself up the last 2 meters of rock with Cole pushing from below, and she came over the edge onto the shelf and lay flat for approximately 4 seconds, just breathing, just letting her body do what it needed to do before she asked it for anything else. "You need to rest," Cole said, coming up behind her. "I need to transmit." "Both. One first." She sat up and pulled out the backup radio. The signal indicator showed 3 bars, which was more than she'd had in the drainage valley, and she pressed transmit and sent Command's authentication code before anything else. The code that said, "This is a verified source. This is not enemy traffic. Do not dismiss this transmission. Static. Then the familiar compression click of an encrypted channel acknowledging. Foxtrot Actual. This is Ghost 1, Authenticate Kilo 79er. I am transmitting intelligence package. Stand by. A pause. Then a voice she recognized. Lieutenant Colonel Dara Vasquez, who ran the FOB's intelligence section and who Elena had briefed twice in the last year. Her voice was carefully neutral in the way that people's voices went carefully neutral when they were processing something they hadn't expected. Ghost 1, Foxtrot Actual. We have you listed as KIA. Confirm identity. I'm aware of my listing. Confirm identity via secondary authentication. She rattled off a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence she'd memorized before the mission as a backup measure. That's my secondary. You can look it up. A longer pause. Identity confirmed, Ghost 1. Another pause, shorter. It's good to hear your voice, Captain. Save it, Colonel. I am transmitting the digital package now. The extraction tool should interface with your receive system automatically. Initiate on your end. Initiating. Captain, what's your status? Operational. She said it before thinking about whether it was accurate, which was its own answer to the question. I also have physical files. I need to photograph them and transmit the images. How is your receive quality? Good. Send what you have. She handed the extraction device to Cole. Hold it up and keep the indicator in my sight. Then she opened the binder on her knee and started photographing pages with her phone, the camera's automatic exposure adjusting to the mountain light, pages of coordinates and dates and target designations. She worked through it systematically. No page skipped, her hand steadier than she had a right to expect given the elevation and the cold and the wound and the 19-minute run. Cole watched the slope below them while she worked. She transmitted 18 photographs in just under 6 minutes, then got back on the radio. Package complete. Digital and physical. Did you receive? Received and confirmed. Captain, the coordinates in these files, I know what the coordinates are. This is a significant package. Colonel? She kept her voice even. I need to tell you something else. Go ahead. The operation was compromised from inside. We had an asset feeding information to Kareem's network. Specialist Jerome Tatum, signals operator, my unit. I observed the exchange directly. She paused. He knew our routes, our waypoints, our comms encryption, everything. The silence on the other end was different from the previous silences. This one had weight. You're certain, Vasquez said. I watched him meet with Kareem personally, hands to hands. I was close enough to count the exchange. Understood. We'll initiate immediately. Another pause. Captain, what is your extraction status? Working on it. Be more specific. We're in the northern sector with enemy search elements approximately 15 to 20 minutes behind us. I have one team member with me. The rest of the team is moving to the secondary extraction point with the first portion of the package. Foxtrot is coordinating extraction options. Can you hold your position? Negative, position is exposed. We have to keep moving. Then move east from your current position to the plateau at grid November 8-4. There's a ridge flat large enough for rotary extraction. We can have assets there and... She heard Vasquez speaking to someone else, the exchange muffled. 90 minutes. Elena looked at Cole. He was watching the slope below, his expression unchanged, but his posture had shifted slightly in the way that people's postures shifted when they were running the distance calculation in their heads. 90 minutes, she repeated. That's the best we can do, Captain. November 8-4 is 5 kilometers east. We're walking into enemy search terrain. I understand that. With a wounded... She stopped herself. Ghost 1? With a wounded operator, she said. 90 minutes. We'll be there. She clicked off before Vasquez could respond and looked at Cole. 5 kilometers east, she said. He looked at the slope, at the eastern ridgeline, back at her. You just called yourself wounded to command, he said. I'm aware. You've been telling me for 3 hours you're fine. I'm functional, she said. There's a difference. Is there? She stood up, which took slightly longer than it should have, and Cole watched her do it without reaching out to help, because he understood that sometimes being helped with the standing up part was worse than not being helped. 5 kilometers, she said. 90 minutes. We need to move in the next 2 minutes, or the timing won't work. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, picked up his rifle, and moved toward the eastern edge of the shelf. "I know," he said. "Why?" The first kilometer east was the hardest because it ran directly across the open face of the slope. No cover. The kind of terrain that made you acutely aware of how visible you were and how little you could do about it. Elena moved fast and tried not to think about the exposed angle. Fast was the only answer to exposed. Moving targets were harder than stationary targets, and there was nothing else available, so she moved. Cole picked up something at the 800-meter mark. He stopped, just a half-step interruption in his stride, barely perceptible, and turned his head slightly left, in the way he did when he was processing audio input from a direction he hadn't been monitoring. She stopped with him, listened. Below, southwest. Voices, not close, not immediate, but audible when the wind cooperated, which it did for 3-second intervals and then didn't. 2 elements, Cole said very quietly. One on the main slope, one on the lateral approach. They're ahead of the main search. Kareem sent scouts. He said it without particular inflection, just noting the fact. He's better than the intelligence suggested. Or the intelligence was compromised along with everything else. She scanned the terrain ahead. There's a gully at the kilometer mark. Natural cover. We get to that and we can assess. If they reach the open face before we clear it, then we're in a different conversation. Move. They moved. The open face felt much longer than 800 meters, which was a property of exposed ground under time pressure. Distance expanded in the same way time did, each step requiring more concentration than it should have, the body's threat response trying to override the brain's geometry. She cleared it. Cole cleared it 3 seconds behind her. The gully was exactly where her terrain memory said it would be. A natural cut in the slope, 2 meters deep, running roughly north-south, filled at the bottom with wind-deposited snow that had crusted over and held her weight as she dropped into it. She pressed against the western wall, and Cole came down beside her. Below them, clearly audible now, she could hear the search element moving. "How many do you think?" Cole asked. 2 at minimum, probably 3. She listened to the sound pattern, the irregularity of multiple footfalls, the occasional murmur of communication. They're moving toward the elevated position we just left. They'll find where we were. Yes. And then they'll know we went east. Yes. So we have maybe 10 minutes before they recalibrate. 8, she said. Move. The second kilometer was faster because the gully ran most of it, providing cover that meant she could prioritize speed over concealment. And she pushed hard, her jaw set against the wound's complaints, putting one foot in front of the other with the mechanical consistency of someone who had removed the question of stopping from the available options. She was somewhere in the 3rd kilometer when she heard the transmission. It came through her earpiece, not on her channel, but she'd set the radio to scan backup frequencies, and what came through was not encrypted. It was clear and it was close, which meant it was tactical rather than command traffic. She stopped walking. Cole stopped 2 steps later, looked at her. She held up one finger, wait, and listened. The transmission was brief, 2 phrases. She caught both of them. The first was a grid coordinate. She ran it in her head against the terrain map she was carrying internally, and it resolved to a position approximately 400 meters north of where she was standing. The second was her name, not her call sign, her actual name, Brooks. "They have my identity," she said. Cole's expression shifted. "How?" "Jerome." She said it without heat. He knew my full name, rank, file number, operational history. If he shared what he had... She stopped. There was no point completing the sentence. Cole was watching her with the kind of attention people gave to something they were trying to understand before it became a problem they had to solve. "If they have your name," he said carefully, "they have more than that." "Probably." "How much more?" She thought about her personnel file, the one command maintained, the one that contained 11 years of operational history, assignment records, training designations, and the particular classifications that had been applied to certain portions of her service record, portions that were classified not because of what she'd done, but because of where she'd done it and under whose authority. "Enough," she said. "Elena." She looked at him. "How much more?" he said again. She breathed out through her nose. The wind had picked up slightly, moving across the slope from the north, which was useful because it would carry their noise away from the search element and not toward it. I spent 4 years attached to a joint task force before this unit, she said. The work was a different category of operation than standard reconnaissance. The records are classified at a level that Jerome shouldn't have been able to access. But if someone with a higher access level was feeding Kareem's network, she stopped again. Then what Kareem knows about me is more than my name and my assignment. Cole said nothing for a moment. What kind of operations? He said. The kind you don't read about in briefings. She met his eyes. The kind that, if Kareem knows I ran them, tells him exactly what I'm capable of in here. Cole looked at the terrain around them, the slope, the gully behind them, the eastern ridgeline with the plateau that was still 4 kilometers away. He'll reconfigure his search, Cole said. Already did. That transmission was the reconfiguration. So we're not trying to outrun a standard search element anymore. No, we're running from something that knows specifically what to expect from you. Yes, a beat of quiet. Does it change anything? Cole asked. She picked up her rifle and started moving east. It means we can't use standard approaches, she said. Which is fine. Standard approaches are what they're expecting. He fell into step behind her. What are we using instead? Whatever I think of, when I need it. He didn't respond to that, but she heard just barely, underneath the wind and the crunch of snow, the particular sound of someone who's been in difficult situations with someone enough times to have developed a calibrated and somewhat exasperated trust in their judgment. It sounded like a short exhale through the nose. It sounded like fine. The 4th kilometer was where everything changed. She heard them before she saw them. A second element, not the one she'd been tracking by sound, but a different one, quieter, which meant better trained, moving parallel to her course about 200 meters south. They were using the terrain intelligently, staying in the broken shadow of a rock band that ran along the slope, and she wouldn't have detected them at all if one of them hadn't shifted position at the exact moment when the wind dropped and left the mountain briefly, absurdly quiet. One footfall on loose stone. That was all. She stopped. Cole stopped. She looked south toward the rock band, and she couldn't see them, but she knew where they were and how many, probably 3, possibly 4, moving in a pattern that suggested some level of tactical training. Not the standard patrol she'd observed in the compound. These were different. She ran the geometry. 2 elements. 1, 400 meters north, now probably moving east in response to the reconfigured search. 1, 200 meters south, moving parallel. The plateau was 3 kilometers east, 90 minutes from transmission, minus however long they'd been walking. She checked her watch. 64 minutes remaining. 3 kilometers. 64 minutes. 2 search elements converging. She had 4 things going for her. She knew the terrain. She knew what they expected. Cole was not wounded and was competent under pressure. And she had been in configurations worse than this and had gotten out of them. Not cleanly, not without cost, but out. She had 3 things going against her. She was wounded. She had no backup. And Kareem now knew enough about her operational background to know she wasn't going to do what they expected, which meant he was going to predict that she'd deviate from the expected, which meant the expected had, in a peculiar inversion, become the less expected option. She almost didn't say it out loud. Then she did, because Cole needed to understand the reasoning. "We go south," she said. He looked at her, toward the element, through it. The detection angle on that rock band is focused east. They're using it for cover while they move. If we come at it from the north, we're approaching from behind their concealment line. And if we're wrong, then we deal with it at close range, which I'd rather do than be caught in the open between 2 elements. Cole looked south, then east, then south again. "Lead," he said. She moved south at an angle, cutting across the slope, using the same terrain logic the southern element was using. Staying low, using the natural shadow cast by the gradient, moving when the wind moved to cover sound. 200 meters at an angle was maybe 300 actual meters of travel, and she made it in under 4 minutes, which was pushing the boundary of what her body wanted to do. The rock band materialized out of the gray slope, darker than the snow around it. The boulders stacked and scattered in the particular way geology made happen when there was no human intent in it. She stopped behind the northernmost boulder and listened. Sound, east, moving east. The southern element was passing. She watched the gap between two boulders and she saw them. 3 men, single file, moving with purpose along the south face of the rock band. Military vests, rifles slung forward. The middle one had a radio handset on his shoulder. The last one was moving slightly slower than the other two, which might have been individual pace or might have been that he was covering the rear. She counted to 12 after the last one passed. Then she moved through the gap they'd vacated. Cole came through behind her. On the other side of the rock band, the terrain opened into a long, gradual slope that ran east for as far as she could see in the mountain light. Wide, open, the kind of ground that would have been dangerous 20 minutes ago and was now workable because the element that would have seen her crossing it had just moved past. She started east at the best pace she could sustain. 2 kilometers, Cole said beside her. 56 minutes, she said. Is that enough? It's what we have. The last 2 kilometers took 41 minutes, which left them 15 to spare, which would have felt comfortable under different circumstances and felt like exactly enough under these. The plateau at November 8-4 was smaller than it had sounded in the radio transmission. It was a ledge more than a plateau, a flat section of ridgeline, maybe 30 meters wide and twice that long. The rock surface swept mostly clear of snow by the wind. The eastern face dropped sharply into a valley she couldn't see the bottom of. The western approach was the way she'd come up. She got there and sat down. Not collapsed. Sat. There was a distinction she was holding on to more firmly than was probably rational. Cole crouched beside her and looked at her side without asking. She didn't protest. He pulled back the layers again, examined what he could see, made a sound that wasn't words. Still functional, she said. You've lost more than you should have. I'll lose more before this is over and I'll still be functional. You don't know that. I know it well enough to operate on. He replaced what he'd moved and didn't argue further, which was one of the things she relied on him for. He pushed when pushing was useful and stopped when it wasn't, and he had a better calibration of that line than most people she'd worked with. She got on the radio and transmitted their position to Vasquez. Vasquez came back immediately. November 8-4 confirmed. Assets are 7 minutes out. Captain, we have a situation. Defined situation. The attack timeline in the files you transmitted, one of the target coordinates is in the continental United States. We are coordinating with federal agencies, but the window is... A pause. 31 hours. She absorbed this. Do you have enough to action it? We're working with what you sent. The coordinates are specific. The method and triggering mechanism are in the files. Then you have what you need. We may need you to clarify certain elements in the physical files when you're extracted. The notation is, I can read it. I'll clarify when I'm on the ground. Copy. Also, another pause, longer. The Tatum situation. We've been running the timeline on what he would have had access to. Captain, if he accessed your full classification history, I'm aware. Then Kareem's network has operational profiles on previous task force work that... Vasquez. She said it quietly. We can discuss what Kareem knows about my history when I'm extracted. Right now I need you to tell me the assets are 6 minutes out. A beat. 6 minutes, 40 seconds, Vasquez said. Copy. She clicked off and looked at Cole, who had been listening to her side of the exchange with the particular attentive stillness of someone parsing what they were only hearing half of. Previous task force work, he said. Not now. Just Ethan. She looked at him, not unkindly, but directly. Not now. He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and turned his attention to the western approach, watching for the search elements she could no longer hear, but knew were still somewhere behind them in the terrain. The wind was the only sound. She pressed her hand against her side and felt the wet warmth there that she'd been not thinking about for the last hour and a half, and she looked at the eastern sky where the extraction assets would come from. And she thought, not about the wound, not about Jerome Tatum, not about Kareem. She thought about the binder sitting in her jacket and the photographs on her phone and the data on the extraction device in her pocket, the files that had been worth what the last 4 hours had cost to get. She thought about grid coordinates on a map. 31 hours. People who didn't know what was coming. The sound, when it came, was distant at first. Rotary blades. The particular frequency of military helicopters that you learned to distinguish from civilian noise after enough time in places where the distinction mattered. She tracked it visually, scanning east. There, two dark shapes against the pale morning sky, moving fast, dropping altitude as they came. Cole heard it too. He exhaled. "There they are," he said. "There they are." The helicopters came in fast and low, the downwash hitting the plateau ahead of them with enough force to push loose snow sideways in sheets, and Elena stood up to meet them, one hand against the rock for the first 2 seconds until her balance sorted itself, then standing on her own, watching the lead aircraft settle into a hover 6 meters off the surface. A figure dropped from the side door. Medic. She recognized the kit immediately, and was moving toward her before the skids touched anything. "Captain Brooks?" The medic was young, maybe 26, with the kind of professional urgency that resolved into competence when you watched the hands. "That's me." "Sir, I need to—" A quick visual assessment, eyes going immediately to the left side where apparently the wound was more visible than she'd thought. "How long have you been—" 4 hours approximately. It's been managed." "With respect, Captain, it hasn't been managed. It's been—" The medic stopped, seemed to decide against completing the sentence. "We need to get you on the aircraft." In a moment, she turned to Cole, who was watching her with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly, something that had relief in it, but also something more complicated. "You did well," she said. "You did well," he said. "I just kept up." "That's not nothing." The medic was still at her elbow. She let him move her toward the aircraft because there was nothing left to move toward on her own, because the plateau was secure and the files were transmitted and Vasquez had what she needed. And in 31 hours, if the chain worked the way it was supposed to work, people would be safe who otherwise wouldn't have been. She climbed into the helicopter. Cole came in behind her. The door slid closed, and the aircraft lifted off the plateau with the stomach-dropping directness of military rotary at altitude. And below her the rock ledge shrank and the mountains spread out, and the compound 12 kilometers west was somewhere in that vast gray spread of highland and stone. And somewhere in it, Rashid Karim was standing over a map that had just stopped making sense to him. She thought about his voice on the radio. Find her. She thought about the server room door standing open at the end of an empty corridor. She thought about a man looking at a missing binder and reaching for his radio with calm hands. The medic cut away her jacket without ceremony and started working on the wound with the focused economy of someone who had learned to move fast in a moving aircraft. And Elena led him, staring at the aircraft ceiling, feeling the altitude change in her ears. "You're going to need surgery," he said. "I know." "When we land, I know." She turned her head and looked at Cole, who was sitting across from her, still in his full kit, watching her with that same complicated expression. "Vasquez has the files," she said. "I know." 31 hours. "I heard." She looked back at the ceiling. The aircraft banked slightly east, and the morning light shifted through the window and lay across the floor of the cabin in a pale, cold strip. "Tatum," she said. Not to Cole particularly, just saying it. Cole said nothing. "He was one of ours," she said. The medic worked in silence. The rotors were loud. Below, the mountains moved past with the indifferent consistency of geology, which did not have opinions about any of this, which had been there long before any of it, and would be there long after. "I know," Cole said finally. She closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She wouldn't sleep, but because there were things behind her eyes that she needed to look at for a moment. The path back through the compound, the young man in the server room, the careful, deliberate way Jerome Tatum had crouched in that mountain depression and accepted whatever had been pressed into his hand. And she needed to look at them now, while she still could, before the debrief and the surgery and the formal machinery of consequence began to process these events into reports and findings and official records, while they were still just what had happened. The aircraft shuddered through a pocket of turbulence and stabilized. The medic said something she didn't fully hear. She pressed her hand flat against the floor of the aircraft, feeling the vibration of the rotors through the airframe. 31 hours. The files were in the right hands. It would have to be enough. She was in surgery for 3 hours and 40 minutes. She knew this because the first thing she did when she came out of anesthesia was check her watch, which was still on her wrist because she'd told the surgical team to leave it there, and they had, probably because arguing with her about it had seemed like a poor use of preoperative time. It was 1847 hours. She'd gone under at 15:06. The math was straightforward. The second thing she did was try to sit up, which the nurse beside her bed prevented with a hand on her shoulder that was polite but remarkably firm. "Captain Brooks, you need to stay flat for at least, how long until I can sit up?" "Another 2 hours minimum." The surgeon was very specific. "What did they take out?" A pause. "The fragment, and some tissue around it there was some damage to the muscle layer. You'll have full function, but the recovery, how long until I can walk?" Another pause. Longer. "That depends on how you define walk," the nurse said. Elena looked at the ceiling. Standard military medical facility. She could identify them by the ceiling tiles and the particular quality of the overhead lighting, fluorescent and slightly too bright. The sound of the place was familiar too, the ambient frequencies of equipment, the movement of people outside the curtain, someone talking in a low voice 2 beds over. "Where's Lieutenant Cole?" she said. "He's been treated and cleared. He's in the briefing area." "I need to be in the briefing area." "Captain, get me whoever authorized this facility's medical protocols and tell them I need to be in the briefing area." The nurse, who was, Elena could now see, about 35, and had the expression of someone who had been asked unreasonable things by wounded soldiers before and had developed a specific internal response to it, straightened up, looked at her chart, and said, "I'll get the attending." The attending was a major named Holloway, which Elena knew because it was on his uniform above his left pocket, and he had the particular quality of military surgeons who had done their work in field conditions. Efficient, not easily surprised, accustomed to being told things that were medically inadvisable by people who intended to do them regardless. "You removed the fragment," Elena said when he came in. "We did." "And the muscle damage?" "Repaired. You'll need 6 weeks of structured recovery to return to full operational capacity." "I need to be in the briefing area in the next hour." Holloway looked at her chart, then at her. "The briefing area is not where you need to be. Major, I transmitted intelligence from the field 48 hours ago, approximately, that flagged an active attack window of 31 hours. I don't know what time that clock is currently at, but I can do the arithmetic, and I need to be in the briefing area." "There are people in the briefing area handling that." "There are people in the briefing area who haven't read the physical files I brought out, because I'm the one who read them in the field, and I'm the one who can cross-reference the notation with the regional intelligence context." She kept her voice level. "Major, how many people are in those coordinates?" Holloway was quiet. "Because I can tell you," she said. "I can tell you the conservative estimate from the briefing I received before this operation. And if you want to make the argument that I should be lying flat while that number of people are inside an active attack window, I'm not making that argument," he said. "Good. I'm making the argument that you are a surgical patient who has been conscious for approximately 22 minutes. And I'm telling you that's enough." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him. He had probably 15 years of medical training, and she had 11 years of doing things in the field that medical training had opinions about, and they were both aware of the nature of the impasse. "Wheelchair," he said finally. "You don't walk. You don't stand. You stay in the chair for the duration. And if your blood pressure drops or you show any sign of—" "Agreed." "I haven't finished." "Agreed to all of it," she said. "Wheelchair, seated, any medical indicator you name. Let's go." The briefing area was 3 corridors from the medical wing, and Elena had been in enough of them to recognize the specific atmosphere before the door opened. The low-grade controlled tension of a room full of people working a problem with a timer on it, the sound of multiple keyboards and multiple conversations running simultaneously, the smell of bad coffee and recycled air. Cole was there, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, and his expression doing the thing it did when he was waiting for something he didn't want to wait for. He saw her come through the door in the wheelchair, and the expression changed briefly. Relief, quickly managed, and he crossed the room. "How do you feel?" he said. "Functional?" "You look functional," she said again. He didn't push it. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez was at the center of the room, and she turned when Elena came in, and her face did something complicated. The particular sequence of a person processing the visible reality of someone they had been talking to as a voice on a radio, now appearing in front of them in a wheelchair with a surgical dressing visible above the gown collar. "Captain," she said, "Colonel, Where are we on the clock? Vasquez pulled up the display on the nearest screen. 19 hours, 40 minutes remaining on the earliest attack window. Federal coordination is in progress on the domestic target. International partners have been notified on the overseas coordinates. How many coordinates total? 7 primary targets, 4 domestic, 3 overseas. Elena looked at the screen. Show me the physical file analysis. We've been working from your photographs. Some of the notation in the binder is, there's a shorthand we haven't fully decoded. I can read it. I was hoping you'd say that. They put the photographs on the screen and Elena sat in the wheelchair and read through them systematically, translating the notation she'd parsed in the server room into operational language that the analysts could act on. It took 40 minutes. It was the kind of work that required sustained concentration, and she did it with the particular flatness of someone who had turned off everything that wasn't relevant to the immediate task. Pain, fatigue, the dozen other things that were waiting to be processed when there was time. At one point, Vasquez handed her coffee. She drank it without tasting it. At another point, Cole said something quietly near the back of the room that she didn't hear because she was focused on a notation about timing sequencing that had implications for the first attack window. And whatever he said, someone responded to it in an equally quiet voice, and neither of them said it again. When she finished with the photographs, she looked up. The domestic target in the notation is a transit hub, she said. The coordinate puts it in the northeast corridor. The timing notation indicates a commute window. High traffic. The method is in the server data, not the physical files. We have the server data, Vasquez said. Then you need to cross-reference sequence notation Alpha 7 in the server files with page 11 of the physical binder. The method is split across both sources, deliberately. Vasquez turned to an analyst. Alpha 7, cross-reference physical page 11. The analyst was already moving. Elena looked at the room. The people in it. The screens. The clock in the upper right corner of the main display, counting down with the implacable consistency of digital equipment. Jerome Tatum, she said. Vasquez turned back to her. Where is he? In custody. He was detained 4 hours after you transmitted the report. He's been processed to a secure facility. Has he talked? Not yet. The interrogation team... He'll talk, Elena said. He's 24 years old and he's sitting in a room that's made clear to him what the charges look like. She paused. He's not a hardened asset. He was recruited, probably with a combination of money and ideology, probably over several months. If the interrogation team understands that profile... Captain? Vasquez's voice had shifted slightly. Not harder. Carefully neutral. The Tatum interrogation is being handled by the appropriate unit. I'm aware of that. What you know about Tatum's recruitment profile is operational inference based on observation. I know. She held Vasquez's gaze. I'm not asking to be in the room with him. I'm giving you what I assessed in the field so the people who are in the room with him can use it. A pause. Noted, Vasquez said. The other conversation, the one Elena had known was coming since Vasquez had mentioned her classification history on the radio, happened 2 hours later, in a smaller room off the main briefing area, with a door that closed. Present, Vasquez, a man introduced as Deputy Director Mercer from the agency that Elena's previous task force had reported to, a man she had never met but whose name she recognized from the organizational structure of the work she'd done before this unit. And a third person, a woman named Rains, no title given, no agency identified, who sat in the corner with a tablet and said almost nothing for the first 30 minutes. Mercer had the energy of someone who managed difficult situations by staying several steps ahead of them, which was usually useful and occasionally made him seem like he was responding to a conversation that hadn't happened yet. Captain Brooks, he said, first, your recovery from this operation was remarkable. I want to be clear that what you brought out of that compound, I need to know what Tatum had access to, she said. Mercer stopped. In my classification history, she said, the task force work, the specific records. I need to know what he could have accessed and what that means for the intelligence Kareem's network now holds. Mercer glanced at Rains. Rains looked at her tablet. That's a complicated question, Mercer said. It's a specific question. The answer may or may not be complicated. Your task force records are, I know what they are. I was there. A pause. Mercer recalibrated. He was the kind of man who made the recalibration visible, which Elena found useful. It was easier to work with someone transparent about their adjustments than someone who pretended they weren't making them. Tatum had signals-level access, Mercer said. That gave him communications metadata and routing information for your unit's operational traffic. It did not theoretically give him access to your classification history at the task force level. Theoretically, the task force records are held at a separate system with separate access controls. Then how does Kareem have my name and operational profile? The room was quiet. We're still determining that, Mercer said. Elena looked at him, then at Vasquez, then at Raines in the corner who still hadn't looked up from her tablet. Tatum isn't the only source, Elena said. Nobody responded. He was the field asset, the tactical layer. But the classification material, the task force records, that came from somewhere else. Someone with higher clearance than a 24-year-old signals operator. Mercer set his hands flat on the table. Captain, the investigation into the security breach is ongoing. I understand that. She kept her voice even. I'm not asking to run the investigation. I'm asking you to confirm what I think you already know, which is that Jerome Tatum is not the complete picture. Mercer looked at Vasquez. Vasquez said carefully, the investigation has identified indicators consistent with a multi-layer compromise. How many layers? We're still determining that, Elena said. I know. She pressed her hand against her side. The wound was a consistent presence, not spiking but steady. The kind of pain that reminded you it was there every time you almost forgot about it. She'd had worse. She'd had worse in places these people in this room had never been told about, doing work that the files they were currently trying to protect had recorded. The task force work, she said. What I did. What's in those records? She looked at Mercer. Kareem now knows the operational profile of what I'm capable of. That's an intelligence asset for his network regardless of whether this operation succeeds or fails. We're aware of the implication. Then you're aware that the breach isn't contained by arresting Tatum. The information is already out. It doesn't undisseminate. What are you asking for, Captain? She thought about it. Not long. She'd been thinking about it since the server room, since the moment she'd recognized the scope of what her personnel file in enemy hands actually meant. I'm asking you to be honest about how bad it is, she said. Not to manage it, not to frame it. Just tell me how much of what I did in the previous 4 years is now known to Kareem's network. Mercer looked at Raines. Raines finally looked up from her tablet. She had pale gray eyes and the expression of someone who made a practice of revealing exactly as much as was necessary, and not one thing more. The operational records from your task force assignment cover 14 operations across a 38-month period, Raines said. The specific nature of those operations, she paused, would give Kareem's network a detailed understanding of your decision-making patterns, tactical preferences, psychological profile under pressure, and the specific training background that informs your field choices. All 14 operations, Elena said. All 14. The room was very quiet. Elena looked at the wall behind Mercer's head. A standard issue wall, institutional paint, a smudge near the light switch that someone had not cleaned, completely unremarkable. Then he knows, she said, exactly why I went back in. He knows I would go back for the files. He knows I would go back for the team members. He knows the specific threshold at which I make the decision to deviate from orders. Yes, Raines said, and he'll factor that into how he rebuilds his network. That's our assessment, which means every operation I run going forward is compromised by the fact that your behavioral profile is known to a sophisticated adversary. Raines said it with the clean precision of someone delivering a verdict they'd already arrived at before the conversation started. Yes. Elena sat with this. The clock on the wall ticked. The distant sound of the main briefing room filtered through the door. Keyboards, voices, the machinery of response to the attack windows grinding forward. What happens to my assignment? She said. Vasquez answered this one. That's a command decision. It's not been made yet. When will it be made? After the immediate situation is resolved. And the investigation? Ongoing. Of course. She looked at Mercer. The second source. The person above Tatum's access level who fed Kareem the task force records. Do you have a candidate? Mercer's expression didn't change, which was its own answer. You have a candidate, she said, We have indicators. Is it someone I know? Captain, is it someone who knew about this operation before it launched? The pause this time was different. It had a different quality than the previous pauses, less about information management and more about something that Mercer, for all his practiced control, hadn't fully decided how to handle. The operation was briefed to command staff, Vasquez said carefully. Standard pre-mission protocol. How many people at command level? 7. And your indicators point to one of the 7. No response. Elena looked at each of them in turn. Mercer. Vasquez. Rains. I'm not asking for a name, she said. I'm asking because what happened to my team on that mountain? The precision of the ambush, the foreknowledge of our routes, the timing that required information that Tatum alone couldn't have provided. Someone at command level was feeding Kareem the operational framework, and Tatum was filling in the field-level details. She paused. My team walked into that mountain because someone in this building, or a building like it, told Kareem exactly when and where we would be. The room was completely quiet. I almost died on that mountain, she said. It wasn't delivered with heat. She said it the way she'd say any operational fact. Flat, specific, accurate. 2 members of my team are prisoners in an enemy compound right now, or were as of... She stopped. Cole. Did we get confirmation on Ose and... She looked at Vasquez. Your extraction team reached the secondary point, Vasquez said quickly. Webb, Reyes, Petrov, all 3 are accounted for and evacuated. What about Ose? A half-second pause. Ose was wounded during the extraction, but he's in surgery here. He's going to be okay. And Reyes? Minor injuries. She's already been cleared. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Okay, she said. Then again, okay. The room stayed quiet. Nobody said anything, which she appreciated. The restraint of not filling that particular silence with anything was the most decent thing anyone in the room had done in the last 40 minutes. She straightened in the wheelchair, put her hands in her lap. Find the second source, she said. The 7 people who were briefed on the operation. One of them told Kareem we were coming. Find out which one. She looked at Mercer. I don't need to know the process. I don't need to be in the room. I need to know that it's being done, and that it's being done by someone who isn't waiting for the investigation to be managed into something comfortable. Mercer held her gaze. I understand your concern, he said. That's not actually what I asked for. A beat. It's being done, he said, without management. She nodded once. 6 hours later, the first attack window was closed. She heard it from the medical wing, where Holloway had successfully argued her back to bed after the briefing room session on the grounds that her blood pressure had done something he didn't like. She'd conceded the point because she'd felt it too, a slight instability in her focus during the last 30 minutes of the session, the kind that came from blood loss and insufficient recovery time, and not from anything she could will her way through. The news came via Cole, who appeared in the doorway of her room at 0134 hours and said without preamble, Northeast corridor. They got there 4 hours ahead of the window. 11 people detained, the device neutralized. She exhaled. Overseas targets, she said. 2 of 3 actioned. The third, he paused. The coordinate was a transit point, not the primary target. They're working back from it. What's the timeline on the third? 7 hours. Who's working it? Vasquez's team. In coordination with the partner agency. They have the cross-reference from the physical files. They have everything you gave them. He came further into the room and sat in the chair beside the bed, which was a cheap institutional chair with metal armrests and the kind of ergonomics that punished anyone who sat in it longer than 20 minutes. You should sleep. I know. That's not you agreeing to sleep. That's you acknowledging that you know you should and have no intention of doing it. I can't do anything useful right now anyway. That's also not agreement. She looked at the ceiling. The same fluorescent tiles as the briefing room, the same slightly too bright light. She wondered if there was a government contract that supplied all these facilities with identical tile and identical lighting, and whether whoever held that contract knew that the product made it slightly harder to sleep and slightly easier to fixate on things. Tatum talked, Cole said. She turned her head to look at him. About an hour ago. He gave the interrogation team the recruitment timeline, 14 months. Started with money. He had a debt situation, personal, family-related, and moved to ideological framing over time. Standard escalation. Cole's voice was even, reporting the facts. He didn't know who Kareem was initially. It was intermediated. He was 3 steps removed from Kareem's actual network for the first 8 months. Who brought him in? Someone he knew from a previous posting. The name is being run now. She thought about Jerome in the snow. 24 years old, economical with words, reliable on 3 previous operations, a debt situation. 14 months of someone gradually reframing what he was doing until the framing felt like it fit. He was used, she said. He made choices, Cole said. He made choices, she agreed, and he was used. Both things. Cole was quiet. The debt, she said. Family related? Do you know what kind? Medical bills. His mother? Apparently she was sick for... He stopped. Does it matter? She thought about it honestly. Not to what he did, she said, but it matters. Cole didn't respond to that. She wasn't sure there was a response to it that wasn't either too simple or too complicated. Outside the door, the facility continued its ambient sound, movement, equipment, the low-frequency presence of people working. The clock on the wall read 0141. Mercer's team has a name, Cole said, for the command-level source. She looked at him. Apparently Raines had it before the meeting with you. They were verifying. He met her eyes. It's Colonel Ferris. She knew the name. She'd been briefed by Ferris's office twice in the last year. She'd sat across a table from a man in his mid-50s with the kind of institutional authority that accumulated over decades and became indistinguishable from competence. He was at the pre-mission brief, she said. He ran the pre-mission brief, Cole said. She lay still for a moment. The pre-mission brief, where 7 command-level staff had received the operational details of a reconnaissance mission into the Black Talon Highlands. Routes, waypoints, grid references, team composition. Everything Jerome Tatum had then refined and confirmed from his field position. 2 layers. Ferris providing the strategic architecture, Tatum providing the tactical detail. Between them, enough for Kareem to build a perfect trap. Is he detained? She said, as of 40 minutes ago. She looked at the ceiling. He was there, she said. At the brief. He asked about our secondary extraction routes. I remember thinking it was a thorough question for that level of the operation. She paused. I remember thinking he was being careful. He was being careful, Cole said, about the wrong things. She didn't respond. The investigation will take time, Cole said. But the core of it, Mercer said the chain of evidence is, he seemed to look for the right word. Significant. He'll lawyer up. Probably. And the military justice process will take as long as it takes. She was quiet. My assignment, she said. The question of what happens to my unit. To me. She turned her head toward Cole. With Ferris detained and the investigation open, every operation he touched is going to be reviewed. Yes. That's years of operations. Yes. Including ones I ran. Cole leaned forward slightly in the chair with the bad ergonomics, his elbows on his knees. Every operation you ran, he said carefully, was run correctly. Whatever Ferris's access to those operations was, whatever he fed into Kareem's network about your profile, none of that changes the record of what you actually did. It changes how the record is read. It might, he said, for a while, until the investigation clarifies it. She thought about this. About records being read through the lens of a compromised commander, about the specific way that institutional trust worked, how it was extended and how it was revoked, and how the revocation tended to move in directions that weren't always fair to the people adjacent to the problem, rather than the problem itself. I'm going to be sidelined, she said. It wasn't self-pity, just arithmetic. Probably for a while, Cole said, while the investigation runs, and the unit. The unit is intact. Webb is already talking to command about reconstitution. Webb, she almost smiled. Of course he is. He filed an operational incident report from the secondary extraction point before he was even fully debriefed. Petrov told me he was writing it on his phone on the helicopter. That sounds right. She looked at the ceiling again. Is Osei still in surgery? The wound was worse than they initially assessed, But the surgeon said, Cole paused. She said it looks manageable. Elena pressed her palm flat against the blanket. Manageable. The word of the day. Everything was manageable. The attack windows, the investigation, the wound in her side, OSE and surgery. Everything was being managed towards something that wasn't the worst possible outcome. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep would fix, which she recognized as the specific exhaustion that followed prolonged high-stakes field work. Not physical depletion, though that was present too, but something more structural. The kind of tired that asked you to sit with everything that had happened and process it at a speed that was slower than events had required you to move through them. She wasn't ready to sit with it yet. Get some sleep, she said to Cole. I'm fine. You've been awake as long as I have, and you're sitting in that chair because you think I need someone nearby. She turned her head to look at him. I'm in a medical facility with people paid to be nearby. Go sleep. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he stood, and his joints made the specific sound that joints made after too many hours in bad positions, and he stretched without any particular self-consciousness about it. 7 hours on the third window, he said. I'll be back before it closes. I'll be here, she said. He went to the door, and she thought he'd leave without another word because that was often how it worked between them. But he stopped in the doorframe and turned back. For what it's worth, he said, what you did up there. Going back in. The files, the compound, all of it. She waited. It was the right call, he said. She looked at him standing in the doorway. The light from the corridor behind him put his face in partial shadow. I know, she said. He nodded once and left. The room was quiet. The clock ticked. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed briefly and then stopped. The facility breathed around her. Its constant ambient sound, the evidence of other people and other problems, and the continuous machinery of people trying to prevent bad things from becoming worse ones. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, but she stopped moving, which was the closest thing available. And outside, in the briefing room, in the coordination centers, in the hands of people who were working from the files she had carried out of an enemy compound with a piece of metal in her side, the clock counted down toward 7 hours, toward the last open window, toward the final accounting of whether what she'd done on that mountain was going to be enough. She breathed in, breathed out. It was going to have to be. The third window closed at 0847 hours. Cole was back, as he'd said he would be, sitting in the chair with bad ergonomics and a cup of coffee he'd brought without asking whether she wanted one, which she did. She was sitting up in the bed. Holloway had cleared her for that at 0600, with the specific energy of a man making a concession he knew was going to be followed by additional concessions and was trying to manage the rate of them. The coffee was from the facility's common room, and it tasted like it had been made sometime the previous afternoon, but it was hot and it was caffeine, and those two qualities covered a significant range of deficiencies. The notification came through Cole's radio rather than hers. Hers had been taken for evidence processing and returned to her at 0730 with a chain of custody form she'd signed without reading. And it was Vasquez's voice, clipped and clean, the particular compression of someone delivering good news in a professional context where celebration wasn't the register. Ghost 1, Foxtrot Actual. Third window closed. All 7 primary targets actioned. No casualties on our side. Stand by for full debrief at 1000. Cole clicked twice in acknowledgement. Elena set her coffee down on the tray table and looked at the wall for a moment. 7 targets. All 7. She did the math on what 7 targets at those coordinates, in those timing windows, would have meant if they'd opened. The conservative estimate from the pre-mission briefing had used the word hundreds. The actual number, if the attacks had run as planned, would have been at the higher end of the range. Crowded transit infrastructure, commute timing, the particular design of the method that Vasquez's team had pulled from the server files. She did not say this out loud. She did not need to. All 7, Cole said. All 7, she confirmed. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The clock on the wall moved from 0849 to 0850, and the facility outside her room continued its ambient sound, and neither of them said anything for a while because there wasn't anything to say that the silence didn't already contain. The 1000 debrief was in the main briefing room, and Elena arrived in the wheelchair because Holloway had been specific about that, and she had decided to stop fighting the battles that didn't need to be fought. Vasquez ran it. Mercer was present. Rains was in her corner with her tablet, which Elena had come to understand was simply where Rains existed. Present, precise, observing. Also present. Webb, who had come in from the secondary extraction point during the night, and who stood near the back wall with his arms crossed in the way he always stood when he was processing something that had a lot of components. Reyes, with her arm properly dressed now, the grays wound from the firefight cleaned and bandaged and visible below her sleeve. Petrov, who looked approximately 12 years old when he wasn't in kit, and who had apparently slept 6 hours and eaten twice, which made him the best rested person in the room. Osei was still in recovery. Elena had stopped by on the way to the briefing room. He was conscious, groggy, annoyed about a drainage tube in a way that suggested he was fundamentally okay, and he'd looked at her when she came through his door and said, "Captain, you look terrible," which was the most genuine expression of relief available to someone who communicated primarily through understatement. "You're one to talk," she'd said. He'd almost smiled. "We got out. Most of us," she said. He'd nodded, understanding what she meant by the exception. In the briefing room, Vasquez laid out the full picture. Elena listened to the parts she already knew and paid attention to the parts she didn't. The domestic operation had coordinated federal and local agencies. 41 personnel deployed, the device located and neutralized with 4 hours to spare inside the attack window. The overseas targets had required international partner coordination, which was messier but had ultimately worked. 3 separate partner agencies on 3 separate targets, all actioned within the window. The intelligence from Elena's transmission had been the critical connector, the cross-reference between the digital server data and the physical binder notation that resolved the split information Karim had deliberately divided between 2 sources. Without both halves, the operational picture was incomplete. With both halves, it was specific enough to action. The decision to return to the compound, Vasquez said toward the end of the operational summary, produced the intelligence differential that made the difference between a partial picture and a complete one. She said it in the flat language of operational assessment, not praise exactly, more like notation. Elena accepted it in the same register. "The investigation," Mercer said when Vasquez finished. "I want to address it directly." He looked around the room. "Colonel Ferris has been formally charged under provisions covering unauthorized disclosure of classified operational information to foreign adversaries. The charges are serious. The evidence is, at this point, substantial." He paused. "The investigation will take time, but I want everyone in this room to understand that the chain of events that compromise this operation and the people responsible for it are being handled with full institutional weight." The room was quiet. "Specialist Tatum," Mercer continued, "has cooperated with the investigation. His cooperation has provided the recruitment timeline and the identity of his initial handler, which has opened a secondary line of investigation into Karim's network recruitment operations." He looked at Elena briefly. "The cooperation was consistent with the profile assessment provided from the field." She said nothing. The profile assessment she'd given in the briefing room the previous day, the inference about Tatum being a recruited asset rather than an ideological one, had apparently been useful. She didn't feel particularly good about being right about it. "The unit," Webb said from the back of the room. Not loudly, but in the way that Webb said things when he decided they needed to be said and had been waiting for the right moment. "What happens to the unit?" Vasquez looked at him. "Reconstitution is pending the investigation timeline. The unit's operational record is clean," Webb said. "Every operation we ran under our command structure is documented and verified. Whatever Ferris's involvement was in the command layer above us, it doesn't touch our record." "That's correct," Vasquez said. "Then reconstitution shouldn't be pending anything." A pause. "The process has its own timeline, Sergeant," Mercer said. "With respect, sir, the process can move faster when there's clarity about what's actually under review." Webb looked at Elena, not asking permission, just acknowledging. "We're ready to return to operational status when command makes that decision." Elena looked at him. She thought about the radio he'd pressed into her hand on the mountainside, and the 18 hours he'd given her, and the way he'd said you come back as if it were an order he had the authority to give. She thought about Webb writing an incident report on his phone on a helicopter. "Noted, Sergeant," Vasquez said. Webb uncrossed his arms, crossed them again, accepted the non-answer with the patience of someone who had dealt with institutional timelines before and knew that patience, applied consistently, was the most effective tool available. Kareem's name came up at 11:40 in a smaller conversation between Elena, Vasquez, and Mercer that happened after the main debrief room had cleared. He wasn't in the compound when it was actionable, Mercer said. We had a window to act on the compound directly, but by the time the intelligence was processed and assets were available, he'd already moved. Where to? Elena said. Unknown. The network is significantly disrupted. The attack operations have been shut down. The command infrastructure at the compound is compromised, but Kareem himself— Mercer set his hands flat on the table again. The same gesture as the previous conversation. Is still in the field. She absorbed this. The exposure of the attack plans, she said, the arrests of the personnel at the 7 target sites, the disruption to the compound. That's not a recoverable position in the short term. No. How long? To reconstitute a network at that scale, with that level of disruption, our assessment is 18 months minimum, possibly longer, depending on his access to resources. And the long term. Mercer was quiet. He's a patient man, Elena said. He built this over years. He'll rebuild. Probably, Mercer said. Which is why the long-term tracking objective is ongoing. She looked at the table. The debrief materials spread across it. Photographs from the physical binder, printouts of the digital server data, the chain of custody documents for the extraction device, the paper trail of an operation that had started as a reconnaissance mission and had become something considerably larger. He'll adjust his model, she said. He knows now that the split-source approach, dividing the information between digital and physical, wasn't enough. He'll adjust. We'll adjust too, Vasquez said. I know. She looked up. I'm not saying it to be pessimistic. I'm saying it because someone needs to be thinking about what the adjusted model looks like. We have people thinking about it. Good. She paused. I want to be one of them. When the investigation is resolved and my assignment is clarified, I want to be part of the long-term Kareem analysis. Mercer and Vasquez exchanged a look. Not the kind that excluded her, more the kind that confirmed something they'd already been discussing before this conversation. That's not an unreasonable request, Mercer said. It's not a request, she said. It's a statement of what I intend to pursue. A small pause. Noted, Vasquez said. Holloway cleared her for limited mobility at 1400 hours, by which he meant she could walk short distances with appropriate caution and was not to attempt stairs, running, or anything that could be described as tactical. She accepted these conditions without argument, which seemed to surprise him. She walked, slowly, holding the corridor wall for the first 20 meters until her body renegotiated its relationship with vertical, to Osei's room. He was more alert than the morning visit. The drainage tube situation had apparently been resolved to his satisfaction, or at least his tolerance. He was eating something that the facility's kitchen had sent, and that he was regarding with the specific skepticism of a man whose relationship with food was more demanding than institutional catering could meet. She sat in the chair beside his bed. How bad? He said. Which part? All of it, starting with the compound. She told him. Not everything. The full debrief would happen formally when he was cleared for it, but the operational sequence. The server room, Cole, the plateau, the transmission, the attack windows. He listened without interrupting, which was how Osei listened, and when she finished he sat with it for a moment. Barris, he said. Yes. He briefed us the week before, sat across the table. A pause. I thought he asked good questions. He did ask good questions, she said, about the wrong things. Osei moved the food tray slightly, not eating, just repositioning it. And Tatum? Cooperating. 14 months. Yes. He was quiet again. Outside the window, Osei had a window, which the room assignment had apparently been made for medical rather than seniority reasons, but it was a window and it showed a section of sky that was pale blue and cloudless at this hour. A bird crossed the frame and disappeared. My mother had medical debt, Osei said, not looking at her, looking at the window. When I was 17, after my father— He stopped. We figured it out. There were options. It took years, but we figured it out. She understood what he was doing and didn't try to redirect it or fill it with anything. People are in different situations, she said. I know. He looked at her. I know that. I'm not saying... He stopped again. I just keep thinking about it. Me too, she said. He nodded. They sat for a moment in the specific quiet of two people who had been through something together and were now in the early stage of the afterward, where the events had happened, but the full weight of them hadn't finished arriving. When are you cleared for debrief? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Surgeon said. I'll be there. I know you will. He looked at her, taking in, she could tell, the pallor and the careful way she was sitting and the visible edge of the surgical dressing at her neckline. You look better than this morning. I look exactly the same as this morning. You look slightly better. He said it with the flat certainty of someone not open to counterargument. Go sleep, Captain. Everybody keeps telling me that. Everybody's right. She stood up from the chair, which required slightly more deliberate effort than it had this morning, and Osei watched her do it with the attentive patience of someone who had decided not to offer help unless it was needed. She made it to standing. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. You will, he said. Bring better food if you can manage it. She left his room and walked back down the corridor, past Holloway's station. He looked up, clocked that she was walking without the chair, started to say something, and apparently decided the battle wasn't worth having. And into her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed and let the morning's accumulated weight settle around her for a moment before she made herself lie down. She was asleep in approximately 4 minutes, which was a personal record for a situation that still had unresolved components, and which her body apparently decided was the appropriate response to everything that had happened since a reconnaissance mission into the Black Talon Highlands had become an 11-day sequence of events that had killed no one on her team and had closed 7 attack windows and had started an investigation that was going to remake the command structure of the organization she worked for. She slept for 6 hours and 19 minutes. She woke up hungry, which was the best possible sign. The formal review board convened 3 weeks later in a building in a city she was not going to name in any document or conversation before a panel of 5 people who had her operational record in front of them and the preliminary findings of the Ferris investigation and the full debrief reports from every member of her team. She sat at the table alone. She had been offered an advocate, the military equivalent of legal representation for a review proceeding, and had declined, which the advocate had advised against, and which she had decided anyway, because she had read her own record and knew what was in it and believed the record spoke more clearly than any intermediary. The panel asked questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Some of the questions were about the operation, route decisions, tactical choices, the decision to return to the compound, the decision to transmit from the exposed plateau position. She answered those directly, in operational language, laying out the reasoning that had underlaid each decision in real time. She didn't over-explain. She didn't defend. She described. Some of the questions were about the task force work, the 14 operations across 38 months. The panel had the records, the classified ones that Ferris had leaked portions of, now fully reviewed and entered into the proceeding, and they asked about specific decisions, specific operations, the specific profile that Kareem's network now held. She answered those too, directly. She'd had 3 weeks to think about how to answer them, and she'd arrived at the same conclusion she always arrived at when she thought about the task force work. It had been done correctly, under proper authority, with outcomes that could be defended. The leak of the profile to Kareem was a problem she hadn't created and couldn't retroactively prevent. What she could do was explain the work clearly enough that anyone reading the record could see what it was. The 5th question from the panel chair, a general whose name she'd known for years and whose reputation was for precision rather than warmth, was the one that had the most weight. Captain Brooks, he said, setting aside the operational record and the investigation findings. In your assessment, do you believe the decisions you made during this operation were the right ones? She looked at him. I believe the decisions I made produced the outcomes that were possible, she said. Whether they were the right ones, I'll be honest with you, General. I've gone through the sequence 100 times in the last 3 weeks. I found 3 decisions I'd make differently with additional time to prepare. I found 2 that were wrong in the moment and happened to work out. And I found one that I'm still not sure about. Which one? Going back for Tatum when I first identified that he was missing, before I knew what he was. She paused. If I'd held position and gotten the team to contingency, the extraction might have run clean. We might not have been in the compound at all. The intelligence we extracted on the return mission might never have been necessary. Or, the general said, the 60% of the package you'd already recovered might have been the only intelligence available, and the attack windows might have opened. Yes, she said, both things are possible. That's why I'm not sure about it. The general looked at her. The other panel members were quiet. Most officers, he said, would tell this panel they're certain every decision was correct. I know, she said. Why don't you? She thought about it for a genuine moment, not performing thought, actually doing it. Because certainty about those things is usually a sign you're not looking at them clearly, she said. And if I stop looking at them clearly, I'm going to make worse decisions next time. The panel was quiet. The general made a note. Asset. The findings came back 11 days after the review. Vasquez delivered them in person, which Elena had taken as a positive indicator before the envelope was opened. People didn't deliver bad findings in person unless the relationship required it, and Vasquez didn't have that kind of relationship with her. Full operational clearance. No disciplinary findings. Commendation for the intelligence extraction under hostile conditions, which was the formal language for what had happened in the Black Talon Highlands. And a note, unofficial, appended to the formal findings in Vasquez's handwriting rather than the panel's typeface, that said simply, the panel found your self-assessment more credible than a perfect account would have been. She read it twice, then folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket. The unit, she said. Reconstituted as of this morning, Vasquez said. Webb already has them in a training cycle. He started before the formal order came through. Of course he did. Osei cleared full operational status 2 days ago. I know, he told me. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the corridor outside the medical wing. Elena had been cleared to leave 3 days earlier, but had stayed for the review findings, which Holloway had tolerated with the specific expression of someone tolerating an outcome they'd expected. Ferris, Elena said. Trial is scheduled for 4 months from now. The evidence package is, Vasquez seemed to consider the right word, complete. Will it hold? The prosecution believes so. There are elements I can't discuss, but the chain of evidence from the task force records to his access history, to the intelligence Kareem's network demonstrably held. It's specific. And Tatum. Cooperating fully. His cooperation will factor into sentencing. A pause. He's 24. The cooperation matters. Elena nodded. Kareem, she said, still at large. The network is disrupted. 7 months of setback minimum, based on current assessment, but he's patient, Elena said. Yes. Then we're patient too. Vasquez looked at her. You said you wanted to be part of the long-term analysis. I did. Mercer's office made a formal request. In addition to your unit assignment, it would be a consultation role. Your field assessment of his decision patterns, his adaptation profile, his likely reconstruction approach. She paused. It's not a promotion. It's more work for the same pay. I know what it is, Elena said. Is that a yes? Elena looked down the corridor. Through the window at the far end, the sky was doing something good. Late afternoon light, the particular golden quality that happened this time of year when the angle was right, the kind that made even institutional architecture look like it was worth looking at. Yes, she said. Email. She found Webb in the training bay at 1700, running the team through a CQB sequence that involved a lot of controlled movement through a mock structure and very specific communication protocols. She stood at the edge of the space and watched for a while without announcing herself. They were good. They'd always been good. The operation in the Highlands had been run against a compromised command layer and an embedded asset and terrain that worked against them, and they'd still gotten most of what they went for and gotten everyone out. Osei was moving with a slight stiffness in his left side that would fade over the next month. Reyes was full speed. Petrov was more deliberate than he'd been before the operation, which wasn't a bad thing. The deliberateness that replaced the automatic movement after someone's first serious engagement was usually an upgrade. Webb saw her when the sequence ended. He crossed the bay to where she was standing. Captain, he said. Sergeant. You're cleared. I'm cleared. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had the expression he got when he was deciding whether to say something, which was a specific expression she'd learned to read over years of working alongside someone. Say it, she said. You scared the hell out of me, he said. On that mountain. Going back in the second time. He said it flatly. Not emotionally, just as a statement of what had been true. I stood on that ridgeline and watched you and Cole disappear into the gray, and I didn't know if... He stopped. I know, she said. The 18-hour protocol, I almost broke it. How close? 16.5 hours. He paused. Petrov talked me out of it. She looked past him at Petrov, who was going through an equipment check across the bay and was very deliberately not looking in their direction. Tell him I owe him one, she said. Tell him yourself. He's right there. Later, she looked at Webb. The team is ready. The team has been ready. The team was ready 2 days after we extracted. I know. We were waiting on you. I know that too. He held her gaze. The thing about Webb was that he didn't blink when he was being sincere. It was slightly uncomfortable, but it was consistent, and she'd learned to receive it without looking away. Don't do that again, he said. Going back in alone without... I had Cole. Without the unit. She looked at him for a long moment. I can't promise that, she said. You know I can't promise that. He was quiet. But I can promise, she said, that if there's a next time, it won't be because I didn't trust you to make the right call. It'll be because the math didn't give me another option. She paused. And I'll tell you the math before I make the call. Webb considered this. The training bay around them was winding down, equipment being stowed, the team moving through the end-of-session routines that all units developed without being told to, the small rituals of people who work closely together. That's not as much as I want, Webb said. I know. But it's more than before. Yes, she said. He nodded once. The crisp professional nod that meant the conversation was finished and the decision was accepted and they were moving on. 700 tomorrow, he said. Mission planning for the next training cycle. I'll be there. Bring coffee. The facility coffee is... I know what the facility coffee is. He almost smiled, turned back toward the team. She stood for a moment at the edge of the training bay, watching them finish their end-of-session routines, and she thought about a mountain 11 weeks ago and a flash decision in the dark, and a man who had looked at her bleeding in the snow and decided she was finished. She thought about the specific quality of his voice when he'd said, "Tell headquarters the ghost is dead," satisfied, already moving forward, the tone of someone who had completed a calculation and moved on to the next one. She thought about the 7 closed windows, the people who didn't know that anything had almost happened to them, who had taken the transit system and bought their coffee and complained about the commute and gone home to whoever was waiting for them, and who would never know the specific sequence of choices that had kept that morning ordinary. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. She left the training bay and walked down the corridor and out into the late afternoon, where the golden light she'd seen through the window was doing what golden light did, making everything look briefly significant and then fading, because that was the nature of it, brief and then gone and then back again the next day. She stood outside for a few minutes, not doing anything, just standing. Her side ached. It would ache for a while. Holloway had been specific about the recovery timeline, and she believed him, not because she always believed medical timelines, but because this one had the particulars right, not a generic prediction, but a specific one based on what had actually been repaired and what the repair required. She would be fully operational in 6 weeks. There was work to do in the meantime. The Kareem analysis, the debrief documentation, the consultation requests that had started coming in from Mercer's office about the network disruption and the reconstruction assessment. Work she could do from a desk, which was not her preferred mode but was work, and work was what she had. And in 6 weeks, the unit. She turned back toward the building. Petrov was standing near the entrance, drinking from a water bottle, and he looked at her when she approached with the neutral expression of someone who had been very deliberately not watching something. "Petrov," she said. "Captain, I heard you kept Webb from breaking protocol." He looked at the water bottle. "I just pointed out the math. 16 hours and 30 minutes was still inside the window." That's not what Webb said. Webb was emotional. He said it without judgment, just noting the fact. The math was clear. She looked at him. He was 22 years old and had come through the Highlands with the intelligence package intact and with the specific quality that certain people developed after their first serious operation. Not hardened exactly, but clarified, like something that had been approximate before it had become precise. "You did well out there," she said. He looked at her directly. "We all did. Some of us more than expected." He seemed to consider this. "I just did what the situation required." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what doing well looks like." He absorbed this without responding, which was the right response. She moved past him and into the building. What? The last conversation was with Cole, late that evening, on a bench outside the facility in the cooling air. Not a debriefing conversation, not an operational one, just the kind of conversation that happened between people who had been through something together and were now on the other side of it and had not yet found the words for what that meant, but were sitting in proximity to the effort. "What happens now?" Cole said. "Work," she said. "The unit in 6 weeks. The Kareem analysis in the meantime." "He's still out there." "Yes." "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It's unfinished," she said. "Unfinished bothers me. But unfinished is different from failed. The network is disrupted. The attacks were stopped. People are alive who wouldn't be." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," he said. "It's not." They sat for a moment. The air had the particular quality of evening in that part of the world, cooler than the day, carrying the faint smell of the surrounding terrain, not unpleasant. "Ferris," Cole said, "trial in 4 months. You'll be called to testify." "Probably." "How do you feel about that?" She thought about this man who had sat across a briefing table from her and asked careful questions about extraction routes, and she thought about what those questions had cost, and she thought about the answer to Cole's question honestly. "Like I want to be there," she said, "to say what happened clearly, on the record, in front of the people who need to hear it." She paused. "That's how I feel." Cole nodded. "And Tatum," he said. "I don't know," she said, which was the truth. She'd thought about Jerome Tatum more than about Ferris, which surprised her, but when she examined why it surprised her, she understood it. Ferris was uncomplicated in the moral sense, a senior officer who had made a choice for reasons that were comprehensible and unforgivable. Tatum was more complicated. 14 months, a debt, a gradual reframing of what he was doing, the specific architecture of someone being recruited rather than someone choosing. "I don't know, she said again. "I think about the mountain. I think about the people who were trying to kill us partly because of what he gave them. And I also think about 24 years old and a sick parent and someone who knew exactly which door to knock on." She stopped. "I don't have a clean feeling about it. I'm not sure I'm supposed to." Cole was quiet. "You're a complicated person, Elena," he said. "I've been told." "It's not a criticism." "I know." The evening deepened around them. Somewhere behind the facility, a bird was being extremely insistent about something. The lights in the building windows came on one by one as the outside light faded, warm and institutional and completely ordinary. "Go home," she said. "You've been here 11 weeks. So have you. I live closer." It wasn't entirely true, but he accepted it. He stood up from the bench, stretched, made the joints after difficult positions sound. "I'll be at 700 tomorrow," he said. "I know you will." He looked at her for a moment, the complicated expression, the one she'd catalogued over days on a mountain. "You're going to be okay," he said. Not a question, just a thing he was saying. The way you said things you knew were true, but that needed to be said out loud anyway. For the person hearing them, if not for the person saying them. "I know," she said. He left. She sat on the bench for a while longer, in the dark that was coming down in that gradual way. Dark came down in open places. Not suddenly, but incrementally, the sky moving from blue to deep blue to something that stopped being blue. The stars were coming out, which they did everywhere regardless of what was happening below them. The same stars over the Black Talon Highlands, and over 7 transit hubs where nothing had happened on a specific morning. The same stars over a compound that had been disrupted, and a network that was struggling to rebuild, and a man who was patient and would not stop. The same stars over a bench where a woman sat with a healing wound and a cleared record and a unit that would be ready in 6 weeks. She was tired. She was going to be tired for a while. That was part of what recovery actually looked like. Not the clean restoration of previous capacity, but the slow, imperfect, sometimes frustrating work of building back toward it. She knew this from before. She'd do it again. She stood up from the bench, her side pulled. She stood anyway. She walked back into the building, into the light and the sound and the machinery of people doing work that mattered. And she thought, not about everything that had happened, not about mountains or compounds or server rooms or men who declared victory too early. She thought about 700 tomorrow, about the mission planning cycle, about the work, just the work. It was enough. It had always been enough. The people who declare you finished are only ever right if you agree with them. Everything else, the record, the recognition, the reckoning, follows from the single decision to keep moving when the world has already written you off. That's not a gift. It's not luck. It's a choice, made quietly, usually when no one is watching. And it's the only one that matters.